My husband smiled faintly as the Customs and Border Protection K-9 lunged toward our luggage. It was a barely perceptible twitch at the corners of his mouth, an expression you can only catch when you've spent 5 years carefully observing every grimace of that particular man. He thought I was about to spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. He believed he had planned the perfect crime. He was going to frame me for international drug trafficking, leaving him free to walk off into the sunset with his young secretary and the millions of dollars he'd stolen from his company's accounts. He had no idea, however, that I had already conducted a meticulous audit of his perfect plan and had quietly written him a brand new ending. My name is Chloe, and I'm 33 years old. Today, I was standing in the VIP security line at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, holding a warm vanilla latte in my hand. I was calmly waiting for the trap to snap shut. If you have never had to systematically outsmart a narcissist who firmly believed you were nothing more than a naive, disposable little wife, you might find my current methods quite extreme. But when you are forced to fight for your own survival against a monster who shares your bed, you learn exactly how to orchestrate a flawless execution. The morning air inside the international terminal was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and nervous anticipation. The fluorescent lights above our heads hummed with a quiet, sterile sound that seemed to perfectly match the rapid beating of my heart. I took a slow, deliberate sip from the paper cup, letting the warmth of the drink ground me again. We were supposed to be flying to the Bahamas. It was meant to be a luxury vacation to save our crumbling marriage. Ethan, my 35-year-old husband, who served as the chief financial officer for a massive pharmaceutical corporation, had booked us first-class tickets. He kept telling me we needed time for just the two of us, to get closer again, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. But Ethan didn't want to get closer to me. Ethan just wanted me to disappear. Right behind us, in the same security line, stood Jessica. She was 28. She exuded a cloud of expensive perfume, and her official title was Executive Assistant to my husband. Unofficially, she was the woman he was sleeping with. Ethan had insisted she take the same flight from Chicago, claiming she needed to handle an urgent board meeting during our layover in New York before flying back to the States. It was an absolutely absurd excuse, a plot so crudely stitched together and so humiliating that any self-respecting wife would have immediately thrown a gigantic fit. The thing is, I had stopped behaving like a normal wife 3 months ago. Now I operated exclusively as a forensic accountant. I analyzed numbers, tracked hidden assets, and observed human behavior, refusing to let emotions cloud my judgment in any way. Ethan was sweating. Despite the pleasant chill from the airport's air conditioning, a thin layer of sticky moisture coated his forehead. He kept glancing at his platinum watch, shifting from one foot to the other in his custom-made Italian leather shoes. His gaze nervously darted between my elegant black suitcase approaching the conveyor belt and the stern faces of the CBP officers standing before us. "Go on, honey," Ethan urged me, placing a hand on the small of my back and pushing me lightly toward the metal detector. "Put the suitcase on the belt. Let's get this over with so we can finally relax in the lounge." His touch sent a disgusting shiver down my spine, but I gave him a radiant, completely oblivious smile. "Of course, darling." I lifted my heavy black suitcase and placed it squarely on the gray rubber belt of the X-ray scanner. Right next to my suitcase rested Jessica's luggage. It was a pristine Louis Vuitton roller bag, screaming a level of wealth she could never have earned on a mere assistant's salary. Jessica stood there, chewing mint gum, looking utterly bored and annoyed at having to endure the screening process with the rest of society, even in this priority line. As my suitcase moved forward, the atmosphere at the checkpoint suddenly, dramatically changed. A CBP officer leading a German Shepherd walked onto our lane. The dog was incredibly alert. Its nose twitched constantly as it systematically sniffed the line of passengers and their carry-on bags. Ethan was practically vibrating with excitement. He tried to mask it with a forced expression of mild irritation, but I could clearly see the adrenaline pumping through his veins. I knew exactly what he was waiting for. Last night, when he was convinced I was fast asleep, I had watched him slice open the inner lining of my checked luggage. I watched as he carefully wedged a vacuum-sealed plastic package, tightly wrapped in black electrical tape, deep into the frame of my suitcase. He had packed enough synthetic opioids to guarantee I'd be locked away in a foreign prison for the rest of my days. It was a brilliant, absolutely ruthless strategy. With me rotting in a jail cell on the other side of the world, he could easily file for divorce, seize all our joint assets, cash in my life insurance policies under the guise of legal difficulties, and vanish into thin air with his Jessica. He would play the role of the devastated, betrayed husband whose wife turned out to be a secret criminal mastermind. But Ethan had made one fatal mistake. He forgot that I make my living by finding exactly what other people try to hide at all costs. I walked through the metal detector. The machine remained completely silent. No red lights, no beeping alarms. I stepped through to the other side, turned on my heel, and began to watch the incredible spectacle with satisfaction. The conveyor belt hummed loudly as my black suitcase emerged from the X-ray tunnel. The CBP officer, staring at the monitor, didn't even blink. He allowed my luggage to slide smoothly down the metal rollers, straight toward me. I reached out, grabbed the handle of the suitcase, and lifted it off the belt. I looked up and met Ethan's gaze. The blood instantly drained from his face. His confident, expectant smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. He stared at my suitcase as if it had magically transformed into a ghost. He glanced at the scanner's monitor, then back at me, his mouth slightly agape. He knew the package he had planted was massive. There was absolutely no way it could have passed through an airport scanner without triggering alarms and an immediate lockdown of the entire terminal. Ethan swallowed hard. His eyes nervously scanned the security area, frantically searching for the trap he had so carefully set. And just at that moment, the German Shepherd reacted instantly. The dog bypassed me completely. It ran straight past Ethan, ignoring his expensive leather briefcase. Instead, it lunged toward the conveyor belt, aggressively shoving its nose into the precious material of Jessica's suitcase. The dog let out a sharp, decisive bark and sat down firmly right next to her bag. Jessica stopped chewing her gum. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed in an expression of deep annoyance. "Excuse me," she snapped at the canine handler. "Can you please get that dog away from here? It's shedding, and this is designer." The officer didn't even apologize. He immediately signaled to the other agents. "We have a positive indication," he announced loudly. Suddenly, the routine hum of the airport queue was brutally interrupted. 3 armed officers materialized out of thin air, completely surrounding the conveyor belt. The shift commander, a man with a stern face, stepped forward, pointing a gloved finger directly at Jessica. "Ma'am, please step away from the luggage and keep your hands where I can see them." Jessica sighed theatrically, clearly convinced this was just some absurd misunderstanding. "You've got to be kidding me. Do you even know who I work for? Ethan, tell them this is a mistake." She turned to Ethan, looking for his support, but Ethan had long since stopped resembling a confident corporate executive. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He was breathing shallowly and rapidly. He stared at Jessica's designer suitcase with wide, terrified eyes as his brain finally began to piece together all the elements of this macabre puzzle. I was standing just 10 feet away, casually leaning against a metal pillar. I took another slow sip of my vanilla latte. The coffee was perfectly sweet, beautifully contrasting with the bitter panic that was now flooding the space between my husband and his mistress. "Ma'am," the shift commander said, his voice dropping an octave as he pulled Jessica's suitcase onto a heavy metal inspection table. "Are you traveling alone today? Did you pack this bag yourself?" "Yes, I packed it myself," Jessica retorted, a note of superiority returning to her voice. "And I demand you handle it with care." The officer unzipped the main compartment of the suitcase. He didn't even bother to look at her carefully folded silk dresses or expensive cosmetics. He immediately ran his hands along the bottom frame of the bag. I watched as his fingers traced the inner lining, pressing against the rigid frame. He found a slight unevenness in the material. With a fluid motion, he pulled out a small tactical knife and slit the lining open. Ethan made a choked, stifled sound. He took half a step back as the flight instinct kicked in. While Ethan fought against total paralysis, the officer reached deep into the hidden recess of the suitcase. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding a heavy, brick-sized package, completely wrapped in black electrical tape. Jessica's face went completely slack. The entitled irritation evaporated from her features, replaced by a pale, trembling horror. She stared at the black package as if it were a venomous snake. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what that is. That's not mine." The officer didn't answer. Instead, he used his tactical knife to make a small incision in the tape, revealing tightly packed, vacuum-sealed bags of white powder inside. He rubbed the substance with a small test swab and placed it in a handheld chemical analyzer. 5 seconds later, the liquid in the vial turned a bright, undeniable blue. "Positive for hard narcotics," the officer stated coolly. Jessica started screaming. It was a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the terminal. No, no. Someone put that in there. Ethan, help me. Tell them I don't know anything about this. Ethan couldn't help her. Ethan could barely breathe. He stared at the package of drugs he had personally purchased and planted the night before. He tore his gaze away from the hysterical Jessica and slowly turned his head to look at me. I held his gaze. I didn't look scared, and I didn't look surprised. I just gave him a very small, incredibly icy smile. And in that moment, Ethan finally understood everything. It dawned on him that his naive, obedient little wife had found his secret stash in the middle of the night. He understood that while he was sound asleep, dreaming of his new, luxurious life, I had cut open Jessica's suitcase and transferred his deadly cargo. Ethan opened his mouth to say something, but before he could utter a single word, a heavy hand fell on his shoulder. A deep, resonant voice cut through Jessica's hysterical screams. "Well now," the male voice said, "it looks like we have a serious problem here." Ethan spun on his heel, coming face to face with a squad from Customs and Border Protection Field Operations that had just entered the security zone. The unit was led by a tall, powerfully built African-American officer in a pristine uniform. The gold captain's insignia gleamed on his shoulders. It was Jamal, my sister Rachel's husband, my brother-in-law, and the absolute last person Ethan ever wanted to see standing between him and the airport exit. How did my husband, a respected CFO in the pharmaceutical industry, end up sweating under the merciless fluorescent lights of the O'Hare departure hall while my brother-in-law prepared to read him his rights? To fully appreciate the poetry of this moment, we must go back exactly 3 months. That's when the man I loved died, and the monster wearing his face finally dropped his mask. It all started on a rainy Tuesday in October. Our marriage had been cooling for a year, filled with a dense, unspoken tension and Ethan's constant excuses for working late. I was sitting at our kitchen island, carefully reviewing our joint bank account statements. As a forensic accountant, I know one thing: numbers speak to me much louder than words. I noticed small, seemingly trivial anomalies, cash withdrawals that made no sense, dinner bills from exclusive, top-tier restaurants on the exact days Ethan swore he was eating stale sandwiches during marathon board meetings. When I confronted him with these facts that evening, the air in the living room instantly turned frigid. He didn't start yelling. He did something much worse. He approached me slowly, placed his heavy hands on my shoulders, and looked at me with a deep, artificially crafted pity. "You're just imagining things, Chloe," he whispered. Pure condescension dripping from every word. "You've been so incredibly stressed with your own job lately. You're losing touch with reality." That one sentence. You're losing touch with reality. For the next several weeks, he used it systematically, like a precision weapon. If I asked about the strange scent of another woman's perfume on his blazer, I was losing touch with reality. If I inquired why he had suddenly changed the passcode on his phone, I was losing touch with reality. The psychological pain was like a slow, suffocating weight. I spent entire nights staring at the ceiling, wondering with dread if my mind was really starting to fracture. He isolated me, making me feel completely dependent on his version of events. He wanted me weak, full of doubt, and absolutely blind. But he forgot one crucial detail about what I do for a living. I tear apart corporate fraud for breakfast. I don't stay blind for long. Instead of breaking down, I saw clearly. I stopped asking him questions and started questioning the data. While Ethan slept soundly beside me, fully convinced he had successfully broken my spirit, I would take my laptop to the guest room and get to work. I wasn't crying. I was conducting an audit. I ignored our superficial joint accounts and delved into his corporate expense reports, cross-referencing data from public records with information about hidden shell companies I suspected him of using. The numbers painted a vivid, undeniable picture of betrayal. I found receipts from a luxury boutique in Paris for a $20,000 diamond bracelet. I found reservations for weekend getaways to 5-star alpine resorts in Switzerland. And through this entire trail of financial breadcrumbs, one name kept appearing: Jessica, his 28-year-old executive assistant, the same girl who always smiled a little too widely at the company Christmas parties. The pain of the betrayal was like a sharp knife straight to the heart, but the financial irregularities I uncovered next were like a ticking time bomb. I realized that Ethan wasn't just cheating on me. He was siphoning massive amounts of capital from his pharmaceutical corporation. All those luxury gifts for Jessica were just a fraction of the missing funds. He was embezzling millions. With this knowledge, I did what any rational woman trained in financial warfare would do. I smiled, cooked his favorite dinners, and kissed him on the cheek when he left for the office in the morning. I became the perfect, unsuspecting wife, while in absolute silence, I built an ironclad, undeniable case against him. And then came the trap. 2 weeks ago, Ethan came home holding a glossy travel agency catalog. He had a wide, boyish grin on his face, the exact one he used to charm me when we first started dating. He announced that he had booked us first-class tickets to the Bahamas. A romantic getaway for just the two of us. He claimed it was all to save our marriage and get close again. He held my hands and delivered a fiery, heart-wrenching speech about how much he loved me and how badly he wanted to fix everything. I almost bought his performance, until he added one tiny detail. By the way, he mentioned casually, Jessica is flying with us on the same flight. According to Ethan, she had to urgently handle some important board meeting during our layover in New York before returning to Chicago. It was the most absurd and pathetic excuse I had ever heard. Taking your mistress on the flight that was supposedly meant to save your marriage wasn't just cruel. It was calculated to the extreme. My internal alarm started screaming. I knew Ethan. He was arrogant, but he certainly wasn't stupid enough to risk an awkward confrontation at 30,000 feet just to keep his girlfriend close. He wanted her to fly with us for a very specific reason. This wasn't a vacation, it was an ambush. He was planning something massive, something that required me to be as far from American soil as possible, and he needed Jessica as his accomplice. Every time he kissed my forehead and repeated how much he couldn't wait for our trip, that one haunting sentence echoed in my head. You're losing touch with reality, Chloe. I packed my bags with immense care, perfectly playing the role of the eager, completely naive wife. I knew I was walking straight into a trap, but I also knew I held the ultimate trump card. He thought I was blind, but I saw every single string he was pulling. I was ready for whatever he was about to throw at me. I zipped up my suitcase. The sharp, metallic sound cut brutally through the dense silence of our bedroom. Ethan didn't even look up from his phone. He stood by the window, his thumbs flying across the screen, a barely perceptible, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He thought I had finally been broken. He believed that months of his psychological torture had finally crushed me, turning me into an obedient, slavish shell of a woman. To understand how I became this cold, calculated version of myself, now standing over the suitcase that would soon become the primary tool of his destruction, you must first comprehend the pure hell he put me through. The realization of his affair and the fact that he was embezzling company money didn't happen overnight. It was preceded by a systematic, absolutely merciless campaign designed to destroy my mind. It all culminated on a stuffy Friday evening, 3 months earlier. I had just wrapped up a massive investigation at my firm, tearing to shreds the financial records of a corrupt logistics company. I came home completely exhausted, my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets, hoping for a quiet dinner with my husband. Instead, I found Ethan sitting at the head of the oak dining table, swirling a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. His posture was stiff and unnatural. The atmosphere in the room was like the thick, electrified air just before a powerful storm. That evening, I confronted him about a discrepancy I had stumbled upon by complete accident. It was a simple notification from our joint credit card about a $2,000 charge from some luxury boutique downtown. I asked him about it gently, thinking maybe he had bought me a surprise gift. Ethan set the glass down. The sound of the heavy crystal hitting the wood was like the gavel of a judge announcing a verdict. He looked at me, but there was no guilt in his eyes, only a deeply unsettling mask of false compassion. There was no charge, Chloe, he said quietly, his voice smooth, coated in a terrifyingly convincing layer of supposed concern. I checked the statements this morning. You must have misread something. I knew what I saw. I pulled out my phone to show him the alert, but the notification was gone. The banking app showed absolutely no such transaction. He had already logged in and cleared the alert, moving funds to cover his tracks. I stared at the screen, my heart starting to race. I know I saw it, Ethan. I know it for a fact. He stood up, walked over to me slowly, and placed his large, warm hands heavily on my shoulders. He looked me in the eyes with a gaze that made me feel completely transparent. You spend your days hunting criminals, Chloe, he whispered. You spend 70 hours a week digging through all that financial filth looking for lies. And now you're bringing that damn paranoia into our home. You're seeing ghosts where there are none. You're turning our marriage into an interrogation. I tried to take a step back, but his grip tightened just enough to hold me in place. You're just imagining all of this, Chloe, he said, his voice dropping to a compassionate whisper. You're losing touch with reality. You're losing touch with reality. That sentence became the horrific soundtrack to my daily life. Ethan used my own career as a weapon against me. Every time I noticed a hole in his stories, every time I caught him in a lie about where he'd been, he threw my profession right in my face. He convinced me that the stress of forensic auditing was causing me to have paranoid delusions. This cruel psychological terror began to escalate. It moved from hiding financial discrepancies to brazenly manipulating my daily life. I'd leave my car keys on the kitchen counter, and an hour later, they'd be gone. I'd find them hidden in a drawer in the guest bathroom. When I'd panic, Ethan would just shake his head, putting on that same mask of deep compassion. You put them there yourself, Chloe. Don't you remember? You're losing touch with reality. He started secretly canceling my social plans, sending messages from my phone to my friends while I was in the shower, claiming I was too exhausted or sick. And when my friends stopped calling, he convinced me that they were the ones pulling away from me because my behavior had become too strange and unpredictable. He isolated me completely, building an invisible cage around my mind. I stopped sleeping. I walked through my own home like a stranger, constantly questioning my own memories, my own sight, and finally, my own sanity. At 3:00 a.m., I would stand in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at a pale face with dark, sunken eyes, wondering if my husband might be right, if my grueling corporate career had finally destroyed my perception of reality. You're losing touch with reality, Chloe. The sentence echoed in the bathroom, under the shower. It reverberated in the silence of my morning commute in traffic. It chimed every time he kissed my forehead and told me I should seek psychiatric help. He was meticulously laying the groundwork. If I ever tried to accuse him of anything, he had already painted a masterpiece of his deceitful narrative. I was the overworked, unstable, and paranoid wife. He was the patient, long-suffering husband. No one would have believed a single word I said. But Ethan made a fatal mistake. He pushed me far too deep into that darkness. When you back a woman who professionally makes her living debunking the lies of others into a corner, she doesn't go blind. She simply adapts to the dark. One Tuesday morning, in the pocket of his tailored suit, I found a crumpled receipt from a luxury hotel. I didn't ask him about it. I didn't start a fight. I just held that small, damning piece of paper, and the fog in my mind instantly evaporated. The paralyzing self-doubt was replaced in a split second by a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear state of mind. I wasn't going crazy. I was being hunted. That brutal discovery was the perfect catalyst. The helpless victim he had so carefully created died that morning, and the cold forensic accountant was reborn. From that second on, I stopped arguing with him at all. I nodded along with his psychological manipulations. I perfectly played the role of the fragile, absolutely broken wife. I let him believe his monstrous war against my mind had been a resounding success. While in complete secrecy, I turned all my professional skills directly onto his clandestine life. I was now looking at him by the window, completely unaware that the woman zipping up her suitcase was no longer his victim. I let him think I was losing touch with reality, just so I could tightly wrap my hands around his throat. This powerful transformation didn't happen with a hysterical scream. It occurred in absolute silence. That pivotal Tuesday, after Ethan left for the office, leaving me alone with that crumpled proof of his betrayal, I went to my home office and turned the key in the lock. I sat down at my desk, fired up my heavily encrypted workstation, and cracked my knuckles. The fragile, paranoid wife was left outside. Behind those closed doors, the woman who had just sat down in the ergonomic chair was a predator in her natural habitat. Ethan was a chief financial officer, which meant he considered himself the smartest person in any room where money was involved. Except corporate budget management and advanced forensic accounting are two entirely different beasts. He could allocate budgets and forecast quarterly profits. I could peel back layers of hidden shell companies, unravel foreign money transfers to tax havens, and trace the smallest digital footprints that exceptionally arrogant men always leave behind. His first huge mistake was completely underestimating my competence. His second mistake was using our home Wi-Fi network to log into his double life. I started with that receipt. It was from a boutique hotel in downtown Chicago, a place well known among a very discreet, disgustingly wealthy clientele. The date perfectly matched a certain Thursday evening when Ethan had adamantly claimed he was stuck in an exhausting board meeting until 2:00 a.m. I logged into our internet provider's portal. Ethan had changed the passcode to his phone, but he never bothered to properly secure the router through which all the traffic from his personal devices passed. I downloaded the network logs from that specific Thursday. It didn't take me long to find the IP addresses associated with a side private banking portal, completely disconnected from our joint accounts. He was using a boutique bank that specialized in high net worth wealth management. The security was top-notch, but Ethan was painfully predictable. He used variations of his childhood street name and the year he graduated from college for everything. Within just 45 minutes, I had breached his secret digital vault. When the main dashboard loaded on the screen, the sheer number of zeros staring back at me made my breath catch. This wasn't just some secret sub-account for buying occasional flowers or booking a cheap motel by the hour. This was a fully functional parallel world. I instantly exported the transaction history to a giant spreadsheet and let my fingers dance across the keyboard. I fired up pivot tables, mercilessly categorizing his expenses and precisely tracking bank routing numbers. The data itself exposed a perfect masterpiece of betrayal in the highest resolution. I saw massive amounts spent at prestigious hotels, like a charge for 3 nights, at an exclusive resort in Aspen, where just entering required a minimum spend of $5,000 per night. A transfer for chartering a private helicopter for a flight to the Hamptons, and the damn jewelry. That pathetic printout for the $20,000 diamond bracelet from Paris was really just a sad prelude. I found paid invoices for emerald earrings, custom-made necklaces from Cartier, and a classic limited edition Rolex. Ethan was throwing money around with the pitiful recklessness of someone who had just won the lottery, blowing through hundreds of thousands of dollars without batting an eye on a secret, luxurious life from which I was completely excluded. And the one name that constantly appeared through this dense trail of financial breadcrumbs was hers, Jessica. Jessica, his 8-year-old executive assistant. The girl who always greeted me with an exaggerated, overly enthusiastic smile and a high-pitched voice whenever I visited the office. The same girl who sent us a lovely fruit basket as a gift for our wedding anniversary. I closed my eyes and pictured her flawlessly manicured nails and designer clothes, which always seemed a bit too expensive for her modest salary. She wasn't just bringing him coffee. She was wearing Cartier necklaces. She was drinking champagne at luxury resorts in the Hamptons. A weaker woman would have taken screenshots at that moment, printed out all those pages, and thrown them in his face the second he walked through the door. A weaker woman would have had a gigantic, screaming fight, demanded an immediate divorce, and fought for a division of assets in court. But I wasn't looking for a messy, chaotic divorce. The deeper I dug into those spreadsheets, the more clearly I realized that infidelity was just a symptom of a much more serious disease. The math just didn't add up at all. Ethan had a very lucrative salary, but he was by no means earning enough to maintain this level of absolutely insane luxury without simultaneously draining our joint marital savings, which, after all, remained untouched. The money in that hidden account came from external wire transfers funneled through 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I spent the next 48 hours, barely sleeping, fueled only by black coffee and a burning, icy fury. I traced those Caymanian LLCs all the way to the source. It turned out they were accounts of supposed suppliers linked directly to his own pharmaceutical corporation. Ethan was generating fictitious invoices for supply chain services, approving them personally as the CFO, and transferring corporate funds straight to his hidden sub-account used for accumulating wealth. He wasn't just a pathetic, cheating husband. He was a corporate embezzler committing massive financial fraud on a multi-million-dollar scale. When I finally leaned back in my chair, staring at the completed diagram of his crimes, I felt a strange, deep, and all-encompassing sense of absolute calm. The tears were completely gone. All self-doubt had been utterly erased. He tried to convince me I was losing my mind, but my mind had never been so sharp and clear. I decided right then and there that I would use my pain as my most dangerous weapon. I became a ghost in my own home. When Ethan came home from work that evening, complaining from the doorway about how incredibly stressful his day had been, I greeted him with a warm, compassionate smile. I took his coat, poured him a drink, and listened to all his pathetic lies with wide-open, endlessly supportive eyes. Whenever he used his favorite psychological manipulations on me, deliberately hiding my keys or flat-out denying conversations we had 100% had, I played my part flawlessly. I let my voice tremble. I apologized for my failing memory. I agreed with him that my job was making me so stressed and paranoid. I gave him exactly what he wanted so badly, a broken, fully obedient, and completely clueless wife. And behind his back, I systematically backed up every single document, every bank transfer, and every falsified invoice, uploading them to a heavily encrypted external server. I built an ironclad, undeniable case against him that would not only guarantee me an extremely favorable division of assets in a divorce, but, above all, would guarantee him a long, brutal sentence in a federal prison. I watched him secretly send texts to Jessica under the table, and instead of feeling my heart break, I only felt the cold, thrilling anticipation of a hunter watching a wolf willingly walk straight into a steel trap. He thought he was the grand strategist in control of the entire chessboard. He had no idea that I had long since reset the entire game. This whole masquerade lasted for exactly 3 weeks before Ethan finally made his ultimate move. It was a Friday evening. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a roast, maintaining the perfect illusion of domestic normality. The front door opened and my husband walked in, exuding an energy that immediately put me on high alert. He was practically vibrating with some manic, artificially created excitement. He walked straight into the kitchen, wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, and kissed me tenderly on the neck. I forced my muscles to relax, leaning into his embrace while my mind frantically calculated what he was up to now. He turned me around to face him and, with a slap, threw a glossy, thick luxury travel agency catalog onto the marble island. The cover depicted a beautiful overwater bungalow suspended above a crystal-clear turquoise ocean. "The Bahamas," he announced, his voice practically singing with delight. "I've booked us 2 first-class tickets for next Thursday. We'll spend 10 days at a private island resort. Just you, me, and the Caribbean Sea." I looked at the brochure with perfectly calculated shock. "The Bahamas, Ethan? But that's incredibly expensive. And what about your quarterly close at the company?" He waved his hand dismissively, pulling me into another tight hug. "The quarterly close can wait, but you can't. We've had a rough time lately, Chloe. I know I've been absent, and I know the immense stress and anxiety you've been dealing with. I want to save our marriage. I want to take you away from here so we can get close again and remember why we fell in love in the first place." It was a truly masterful performance. If I hadn't spent the last month meticulously tracing his embezzlement schemes and reading receipts from luxury hotels for his 8-year-old mistress, I probably would have burst into tears of happiness. Instead, I let tears of false gratitude well up in my eyes. I returned the hug, hiding my face in his chest, so he couldn't see my icy, calculated gaze. "Thank you," I whispered. "This is exactly what we need right now." He pulled away slightly, still holding my shoulders, and gave me a somewhat apologetic smile. "There's just one tiny catch," he said smoothly. "The flights I booked have an overnight layover in New York. The European board has scheduled a huge emergency meeting for Friday morning. I told them I couldn't make it, but they insisted that someone from management had to be there to personally deliver the hard copy financial forecasts. So, I'm sending Jessica." That name hung in the heavy air between us. Jessica. My husband was taking me on a luxury vacation meant to save our marriage, and he was bringing his mistress along on the very same flight. The sheer audacity of the lie was simply breathtaking. Sending an assistant to New York to hand-deliver paper documents to the board in an era of digitally encrypted files was an excuse so unbelievably thin and fragile that it bordered on a blatant insult. He was treating me like a complete idiot. But I reminded myself of the first, most important rule of forensic accounting. When a suspect hands you a fabricated ledger, you don't throw it in his face. You accept it, you smile, and you use it to build him a cage. "Oh," I said, maintaining a light, completely unsuspicious tone. "She's flying with us?" Ethan laughed out loud, shaking his head. "Of course not. Don't be silly. She's flying economy. We have first class. She'll pick up her luggage in New York, go to the board's office, and we'll calmly catch our connecting flight to Nassau. You won't even notice she's there, I promise." I nodded, giving him a radiant smile full of absolute trust. "Well, if it keeps your position at the company secure and finally gets us to the beach, then I guess it's okay." He kissed my forehead, called me the most understanding wife in the world, and went upstairs to take a shower. I was left alone in the kitchen, staring at that glossy brochure. The Bahamas was an extradition nightmare. It was a country where an American could disappear without a trace, or where a tragic accident could happen, far beyond the jurisdiction of U.S. law enforcement. But Ethan wasn't the type of guy who would get his hands dirty with blunt physical violence. He was a financier. He operated with schemes, leverage, and paper trails. Since he was taking Jessica with him, this wasn't a murder plot, it was a setup. He needed to get me out of the picture permanently, and he needed a witness or an accomplice to help him achieve that goal during transit. For the next 5 days, the tension in our house thickened like tar. I continued my daily routine, packing my bags with calculated care. I pulled my elegant black suitcase from the walk-in closet and began filling it with swimsuits, light dresses, and sunscreen. Every time I placed another item inside, a dozen worst-case scenarios flashed through my mind. I knew this was the suitcase he intended to use. It was the only variable in this whole trip over which he could exercise absolute control. I made sure to leave it open in the corner of our bedroom, an inviting, vulnerable target for whatever he had planned. That week, Ethan played the role of the devoted husband flawlessly. He brought home my favorite takeout. He massaged my shoulders when I complained of a headache. He constantly used that condescending tone of his, telling me how good this trip would be for my mental health. "You'll feel so much better once we get out of the city, Chloe. You'll finally be able to let go of all that paranoia. You'll get back in touch with reality again." Every time he said those words, I filed them safely away in the vault of my mind, forging his psychological abuse into pure, high-octane fuel. By Wednesday evening, the air in our house had become thick with unspoken anticipation. I watched from the shadows as Ethan casually packed his own designer luggage, whistling a cheerful tune under his breath. He was so horribly certain of his own superiority. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone his company, his mistress, and above all, his naive, pathetic little wife. He had no idea that I had long since secured all the evidence of his foreign accounts. He had no idea that I knew every single detail of his illicit, dirty life. As I placed my favorite silk nightgown into the black suitcase, I felt a strange thrill coursing through my veins. The trap was perfectly set, with the only difference being that he was now walking blindly straight into its steel jaws. I zipped the suitcase halfway, leaving the inside perfectly accessible. The stage was set. Tomorrow morning, we were heading to O'Hare International Airport. Tomorrow, the long execution would begin, and I would be the only one holding the axe. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked from 1:59 to 2:00 a.m. The sharp red glow illuminated the contours of our bedroom, casting long shadows on the floor. I lay completely still on my side of the massive king-sized bed, staring straight at the wall. I calmed my breathing, drawing air in through my nose and releasing it through my mouth in a slow, rhythmic tempo. I had to perfectly feign the deep sleep of a wife who wholeheartedly believed her husband was taking her on a romantic getaway. My eyes were closed, but all my senses were sharpened to the point of pain. I was like a string stretched to its breaking point, vibrating with anticipation. The mattress shifted slightly. The sudden absence of Ethan's weight sent a cool draft across my back. I maintained my steady breathing. I didn't flinch. I didn't move a single muscle. I cracked my eyelids open a fraction of a millimeter, peering through my lashes at the dimly lit room. Ethan was standing next to the bed. His silhouette was stark against the moonlight filtering through the blinds. For a long moment, he stood completely still, looking down at me, checking to see if his movement had woken me. I let out a soft, sleepy sigh and nestled my head deeper into the pillow, playing the part of the exhausted woman he thought I was. Satisfied, he turned and moved with a practiced, predatory silence across the room to his large walk-in closet. I heard the gentle rustle of fabric, followed by the metallic click of his floor safe being unlocked. When he emerged a minute later, he was holding something massive. It was a rectangular block, the size of a thick textbook, wrapped entirely in matte black electrical tape. Even in the semi-darkness, the package looked heavy and dense. It looked exactly like the contraband displayed on metal tables during police drug raids. He carried the black brick to the corner of the room where my open, elegant black suitcase was waiting. My heart was hammering against my ribs in such a wild, violent rhythm that I was terrified he would hear it from across the room. "You're losing touch with reality, Chloe." The sentence echoed loudly, mockingly in the empty corners of my mind. This was the exact moment when the reality of his psychological warfare fully materialized into physical danger. He wasn't just using sophisticated gaslighting to cover up a cheap office affair. He was orchestrating my absolute annihilation. Ethan knelt beside my suitcase, reached into the pocket of his sweatpants, and pulled out a small, sharp utility knife. With horrifying fascination, I watched as my husband carefully pushed aside the clothes I had packed just hours before. He found the zipper at the very bottom, the one that gave access to the inner lining and the suitcase frame. He unzipped it halfway, but the slit wasn't wide enough to accommodate the bulky black package. Without a moment's hesitation, Ethan pressed the blade against the thick nylon material and cut the lining. The sound of the rip was quiet, like the gentle hiss of threads breaking, but to me, it sounded like a gunshot. It was the sound of my marriage being permanently and brutally severed. He shoved the tape-wrapped brick deep into the empty space between the hard plastic shell and the fabric lining. He pressed it flat, maneuvering the corners to ensure there were no suspicious bulges. Once the package was perfectly hidden, he smoothed over the cut lining and meticulously arranged my dresses and swimsuits back over the hidden compartment. He zipped up the main compartment of the suitcase, patting the top with a disgustingly triumphant gesture. "You're losing touch with reality, Chloe?" The voice in my head was now deafening. The sheer scale of his betrayal washed over me like icy water. He wasn't just planning to divorce me and run off with his young assistant. He was sending me to a foreign prison in a jurisdiction famous for its absolute zero-tolerance policy on drugs, a place where an American woman could vanish without a trace in a nightmare of concrete and steel. If his plan succeeded, I would be flagged at an international checkpoint. I would be dragged into a room lit by aggressive fluorescent lights, screaming my innocence while foreign agents pulled a brick of hard drugs from my personal luggage. And Ethan would stand by, perfectly playing the role of the shocked husband. He would shake his head in disbelief, telling investigators that his wife had been acting very irrationally lately, that she was losing touch with reality. He would use the very psychological instability he had so painstakingly manufactured to seal my fate. I would be locked in a cell for decades. He would return to Chicago a tragic hero, with a clear path to inherit my life insurance policies, our house, and the millions he had stolen from his corporation, living happily ever after with his mistress. The sheer cruelty of the act was simply breathtaking. It was a monstrous, sociopathic calculation that defied any human empathy. He wanted me to spend the rest of my life rotting in a cage, doubting my own sanity until my last day. He stretched his arms over his head, letting out a quiet, satisfied sigh. The executioner had just set his trap. He returned to his side of the bed, slid under the covers, and settled comfortably on his pillows. Within 10 minutes, his breathing deepened into a steady rhythm. He was sleeping like a baby. He was sleeping like a man who didn't have the weight of someone else's destroyed life on his conscience. He had just signed my death warrant with a utility knife and a roll of black electrical tape, and yet his chest rose and fell in perfect harmony. I lay there in the darkness with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't crying. The fragile, paranoid wife he had tried so hard to create was now completely dead. The woman now lying next to him in the dark was someone entirely different. My grief had crystallized into something incredibly cold, hard, and terrifyingly precise. I waited another 30 minutes to ensure he was fully submerged in deep sleep. The house was dead silent. Slowly, I slipped the covers off my shoulders. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. The game was no longer his. The nightly betrayal was complete, and now it was my turn to move. The hardwood floor was freezing against my bare feet. As I moved away from the bed, I didn't look back at Ethan. His deep, steady breathing filled the bedroom, a sound that once brought me comfort, but now only cemented my determination. I moved with the silent, practiced grace of a shadow, crossing our massive master bedroom toward the corner where my elegant black suitcase waited. Moonlight seeped through the wooden blinds, illuminating the baggage, a piece of evidence at a crime scene. I knelt by the suitcase, my knees pressing into the plush wool rug. My hands hovered just above the zipper. I had to be absolutely meticulous. Every tiny movement required the precision of a surgeon operating on an extremely unstable patient. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, I pulled the zipper open, ensuring the metal teeth made absolutely no sound. The scent of my expensive floral perfume rose from the neatly folded clothes, a stark contrast to the ruthless betrayal buried deep beneath them. I carefully lifted the top layer of silk dresses and linen pants, setting them aside in the exact same configuration they had been packed. I reached the bottom lining of the suitcase. My fingers roamed over the nylon material until they found the fresh, frayed incision Ethan had made just a short while ago. My heart hammered against my ribs in a frantic, panicked rhythm, but my hands remained completely calm and steady. I slipped my fingers into the dark gap between the hard polycarbonate shell of the suitcase and the fabric lining. The package was dense and hard. It felt like a block of solid concrete. I gripped the edges of the black electrical tape and slowly began to pull the package out of the tight space. The friction of the rubbery tape against the nylon made a quiet, scraping sound, causing me to freeze instantly. I held my breath, listening intently. Ethan's snoring paused for a second, then resumed its steady, sleepy rhythm. I released a slow, controlled stream of air from my lungs and pulled the package completely out. It weighed at least 3 pounds. As I held it in my hands, the terrifying reality of my husband's sociopathy finally took on a tangible, physical weight. I clutched the black brick to my chest and stood up. I passed our ensuite bathroom, knowing that turning on the bright light so close to the bed was too great a risk. Instead, I silently slipped out into the hallway and made my way to the home office at the opposite end of the floor. I went inside, closed the heavy mahogany door behind me, and turned the lock with a quiet but decisive click. I turned on the small desk lamp, casting a focused pool of warm yellow light onto the glass top of my desk. I placed the black package in the very center of that illuminated circle. The black electrical tape was wrapped in chaotic, overlapping layers, designed so that any attempt to tamper with it would be immediately noticeable. But forensic accountants are perfectly trained in how to dismantle complex structures piece by piece without leaving the slightest trace. I opened my desk drawer and took out a specialized bookbinding scalpel I normally used for precision document binding. I sat down, leaning close over the package. I carefully examined the tape's seams, searching for the final edge. I found it hidden on the very bottom, where Ethan had finished wrapping. Holding my breath, I slid the razor-sharp tip of the scalpel under the adhesive. I applied microscopic pressure, cutting upward in a perfectly straight line. The thick tape parted smoothly. I began to peel back the heavy black layers one by one, working with monstrous patience to preserve the adhesive's stickiness, so it could all be sealed back up without a trace later. Under the electrical tape was a thick layer of industrial vacuum-sealed plastic. Through the transparent material, I saw it. The white powder was packed incredibly tight, pressed into a solid, chalky mass. My blood ran cold, freezing me to the very marrow. I'm a financial investigator, not a drug expert. But the sheer volume of the synthetic substance staring back at me was absolutely unequivocal. This wasn't an amount for personal use. This was a purely wholesale quantity intended for trafficking. My mind immediately calculated the legal consequences. The Bahamas operates under strict anti-drug laws. International transit through hubs like New York or Miami with such a quantity of synthetic drugs carries mandatory, draconian minimum sentences. Ethan didn't just want me to be arrested. He was sentencing me to life in a brutal foreign prison. He wanted me locked in a concrete cell, stripped of my rights, my career, and my freedom, completely unable to defend myself, all while he played the role of the grieving husband, safe in Chicago. The breathtaking malice and perfidy required to carry out such a plan made my hands tremble for a short, fleeting second. I stared at the powder, my mind frantically analyzing his strategy. But something didn't feel right. The package was thick, but when I carried it down the hall, the weight distribution felt slightly uneven. My investigative instincts kicked in. You never just look at the surface numbers. You always look at what's buried deep beneath the ledger. I pressed my thumbs firmly on the heat-sealed plastic, examining the dense block of powder. The surface was hard, but as I ran my fingers along the bottom edge, I felt a distinct, unnatural bulge. It was small, rectangular, and completely rigid. This wasn't a lump of drugs, it was hardware. Using the scalpel, I made a tiny, almost imperceptible incision in the very corner of the vacuum-sealed package. The hiss of escaping air was barely audible. I maneuvered the compressed powder, shifting the white mass just enough to push the hidden object toward the opening. A small black object slid out of the powder and hit the glass surface of my desk with a quiet clink. It was a flash drive. The device was sleek, heavily reinforced, and bore the logo of a manufacturer of military-grade encryption hardware. It was exactly the kind of drive top-level executives use to transport sensitive trade secrets across hostile borders. I stared at the device as my analytical mind pieced together the final elements of the puzzle. Ethan was a genius of corporate finance, but he suffered from the ultimate flaw attributed exclusively to arrogant men. He wanted a clean cut. He didn't just want to frame me for drug trafficking. He was framing me for his own corporate embezzlement. When the authorities detained me at the airport, they would seize the drugs and confiscate the flash drive as evidence. When they broke the encryption, they would find the ledgers, the foreign account numbers, and the digital trail of the $15 million that had vanished from his pharmaceutical company. And it would all be neatly packed in my luggage. The authorities would conclude that I was the mastermind, the paranoid, mentally unstable wife who had embezzled millions and was trying to flee the country with a bag full of drugs. Ethan would be completely cleared of all charges, a tragic victim of his wife's hidden criminal empire. He would keep the real money safe in foreign accounts, clear his name at the company, and walk away completely scotangent-free. I picked up the flash drive. It was cold to the touch. A lethal digital weapon designed to bury my reputation along with my freedom. I brushed a few specks of white powder off the metal casing. This betrayal was so deep, so meticulously evil, that it went far beyond simple anger. It had turned into an absolute, terrifyingly clear state of mind. He wanted a war of information. He wanted to use digital forensics to destroy me. Except he had brought a knife to a gunfight. Clutching the flash drive tightly in my hand, I fired up my own heavily encrypted laptop. It was time to see exactly how much rope my husband had given me to hang him with. The cold metal slid smoothly into the port of my heavily modified hardware. The screen came to life, casting a sharp, pale blue light on my face. In the center of the display, a sleek, minimalist window appeared, requesting a password. It was military-grade encryption, the kind designed to completely wipe the device's memory if the wrong password was entered 10 times in a row. Ethan had bought top-of-the-line security, but he was undone by the fatal arrogance of a man who believed his wife was technologically illiterate. He thought I spent my days adding up simple columns of numbers. He didn't realize that my daily routine involved breaking into the encrypted financial fortresses of corrupt billionaires. I didn't waste my limited attempts guessing the names of his childhood pets or his favorite whiskey. Instead, I launched a proprietary decryption protocol I had designed years ago to penetrate foreign tax havens. Lines of green code cascaded down my screen in a rapid, hypnotic waterfall. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, sipping a glass of ice-cold water, and watched as my software brutally shattered his expensive digital lock. The silence in the house was absolute, except for the rhythmic, quiet hum of my laptop's fan. Every passing minute stretched on like an hour. I kept one ear constantly tuned to the hallway, listening for the creak of floorboards that would signal Ethan had woken up to find the bed empty. But he slept soundly, lulled by the pure, unadulterated confidence of his own sociopathy. 7 minutes later, a sharp, satisfying click came from the computer's speakers. The encryption barrier had finally fallen. The drive successfully mounted on my desktop. I opened the main directory. Inside were 3 separate folders, meticulously organized with the clinical precision Ethan applied to everything in his life. The first folder was labeled with the name of a dormant pharmaceutical research project. I clicked it. The screen filled with a gigantic, complex spreadsheet. This was his master ledger. My eyes scanned the rows and columns, instantly translating the raw data into a terrifying narrative. It perfectly mirrored the initial trail of embezzlement I had discovered just a few weeks ago, but the scale of the operation was exponentially larger than I had initially assumed. Ethan hadn't just siphoned off a few $100,000 for luxury trips with Jessica. He had been systematically bleeding his company dry for a period of 4 years. He had created an incredibly extensive network of shell suppliers, generating fictitious invoices for chemical raw materials that didn't even exist. The funds were approved by his own department, paid out to Caymanian LLCs, and immediately transferred to a veritable labyrinth of foreign slush fund accounts. I highlighted the final column and ran a sum. The total value of the stolen assets was just over $15 million. I opened the second folder. This one contained a series of text documents filled with seemingly random strings of words, seed phrases. Ethan hadn't left that $15 million in vulnerable international bank accounts. He had meticulously converted the stolen traditional cash into completely untraceable cryptocurrencies. He had divided this fortune and stored it in multiple so-called cold wallets. The digital keys required to access these wallets were right here, on this flash drive. With these phrases, he could access his stolen empire from any laptop, anywhere on the planet, from a private villa in the Bahamas, from some paradise that had no extradition treaty. The sheer scale of his greed was breathtaking, but it was the contents of the third folder that made my blood freeze in my veins. The folder was titled simply, Archive. I opened it and found a whole collection of fabricated digital evidence. There were draft emails manipulated to look as though they had been sent from my private IP address. These messages were addressed to shady foreign chemical suppliers and discussed the logistics of moving synthetic drugs. There was even a forged digital confession, written perfectly in my tone, expressing deep regret that I had let greed push me into international trafficking. Ethan had manufactured an entire alternate reality in which I was the criminal mastermind. The full picture of his plot finally came together. It was a devastatingly perfect mechanism designed to completely erase me. The heavy package of drugs in my suitcase was just the physical bait. When the airport K9 units inevitably flagged my bag, the authorities would tear it apart. They would find a huge amount of synthetic drugs and this heavily encrypted flash drive. Once international cyber units broke the drive's security, they would discover the theft of $15 million from the corporation and the fabricated emails linking me directly to both crimes. The authorities would look at my career as a forensic accountant and conclude that I possessed the exact skill set required to pull off such a massive corporate heist. They would assume I used the money stolen from the company to buy the drugs, trying to flee the country and start a new life. Ethan would stand in the airport terminal, perfectly playing the role of the terrified, betrayed husband. He would cooperate fully with the authorities, tearfully giving them every piece of information they asked for. I would be tried and convicted in a foreign jurisdiction known for its absolutely draconian justice system. I would be locked in a concrete cell for the rest of my days, completely silenced, with no chance of defending myself against the mountain of digital evidence he had planted in my luggage. Life in a foreign prison is essentially a death sentence. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Ethan would be reaping the rewards of his success. As the innocent, grieving spouse, he would retain full control of all our assets. He would cash in my huge life insurance policies. The pharmaceutical company, convinced they had caught the crazed accountant responsible for the theft, would close its internal investigations. Ethan's name would be completely cleared. He would wait a respectable period of mourning, then quietly disappear. He would fly off to a beautiful, sun-drenched island with his young assistant, logging into his $15 million in untraceable cryptocurrencies. They would live like royalty on the ashes of my destroyed life. It was a flawless execution strategy. Assuming, of course, that the victim was an unsuspecting, trusting wife who would blindly drag a prepared suitcase to an international airport. But Ethan had completely underestimated his opponent. He thought he was playing chess against a pawn. He didn't realize that I had long since flipped the entire board upside down. I leaned back deep in my chair, staring at the screen. The initial shock had completely evaporated, replaced by an absolute icy determination. He wanted to destroy me with data. He wanted to use my own profession to dig my grave. I reached for my encrypted drive and connected it to the laptop. I started copying every single file, every seed phrase, every fabricated email, and the master ledger of his $15 million theft. I was taking his ammunition. I was taking his future. I was taking his life. The transfer progress bar glowed neon green on my screen, a steady, inexorable march toward 100%. I watched as every single byte of Ethan's stolen empire flowed from his heavily encrypted hardware straight to my ghost server. I had configured this undetectable cloud architecture years ago to secure documents from whistleblowers and track foreign corporate fraud. It was located on servers in jurisdictions that would never bow to a subpoena from any government agency, prosecutor, or court. Now, it held my husband's digital death warrant. The file transfer ended with a short, dull beep. I safely ejected the flash drive and pulled it from the port. It lay in my hand, feeling completely different. It no longer held any secrets. Now, it was just a loaded gun. I looked down at the black brick of synthetic drugs resting on my glass desk. A normal person, a civilian touched by the brutal realities of the justice system, would immediately grab their smartphone, dial 911, and scream for the police to come to the house, frantically pointing at the drugs and the husband sleeping in the master bedroom. But I am not a civilian. I am a forensic accountant. I have spent my life in courtrooms, prosecutors' offices, and interrogation rooms, watching disgustingly expensive defense attorneys twist reality to the point where the truth becomes completely unrecognizable. If I called the police now, Ethan would wake up, rub his eyes, and start playing the confused victim. He would look at the officers with that practiced, pitying expression of his. He would tell them I had been acting erratically for months. He would claim he had never seen the package before in his life. He would suggest, with a trembling voice, that my stressful career had finally led me to a nervous breakdown and that I had somehow obtained the drugs during a manic episode. Without hard, irrefutable proof that he was the one who put the package in my suitcase, the whole story would devolve into a murky, chaotic domestic dispute. He had the corporate pedigree, the fabulously expensive suits, and the carefully cultivated reputation of a dedicated CFO. I would be the hysterical wife holding 3 pounds of drugs in her own home office. The risk was simply unacceptable. Ethan had to be caught in a scenario where his guilt would be absolutely indisputable. He had to be caught red-handed, completely stripped of any possibility of spinning another deceitful story. He had to walk into a trap designed with such precision that not even the most expensive corporate lawyers in Chicago could get him out of it. I wasn't going to let him negotiate a plea deal, voluntarily surrender, or play the innocent. I wanted his own greed and massive arrogance to lead him straight to the gallows. I picked up the flash drive and slid it back into the tiny incision I had made in the vacuum-sealed plastic. I pushed it deep into the compressed white powder, making sure it was buried exactly where he had placed it himself. Then, I reached into my office supply drawer and pulled out a roll of matte black electrical tape. I had bought this specific brand for binding thick financial files. It was the exact same tape Ethan had used. I worked with the steady, measured precision of a bomb disposal expert. I stretched a fresh piece of tape over the incision, pressing it flat, meticulously smoothing out any microscopic air bubbles and creases. When I was finished, I held the heavy black brick up to the desk lamp. It was flawless. Ethan could have examined it closely and would never have suspected that it had been cut open, decrypted, and turned against him as a lethal weapon. I carried the massive package back down the dark hallway, my bare feet treading silently on the wooden floor. Our master bedroom looked exactly as I had left it. The moonlight still painted long shadows on the carpet. Ethan was snoring softly, his chest rising and falling in a deep, blissful, and utterly oblivious sleep. I knelt beside my open black suitcase. I did not put the package back in the lining. That was his plan, not mine. Instead, I left the perfect cut exposed, carefully arranging the folded clothes back in place to make it look as though the package was still hidden underneath. I zipped the suitcase all the way up. I took the black brick and went into my walk-in closet, hiding it deep at the bottom of my huge leather tote bag, the bag I would have with me at all times on the way to the airport in the morning. The decision to let his own arrogance utterly destroy him wrapped around me like a heavy, incredibly comforting blanket. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to direct a spectacular public execution. I would let him walk into the international terminal fully convinced he was the smartest man in the world. I would let him feel that intoxicating thrill of impending triumph. And then, at the absolute last possible second, I would perform the ultimate masterful illusion. He wanted to use Jessica as a pretty prop, a naive assistant he could escape with while I was locked in a foreign cell. It was almost poetic that she would become the instrument of his final downfall. I went into the bathroom adjoining the bedroom and turned on the cold water tap. I splashed the icy liquid on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at me was nothing like the devoted wife who had lived in this house for the past 5 years. Her eyes were dark, empty, and completely devoid of pity. I dried my face with a towel and returned to the bedroom. I slid under the covers, pulling the thick material up to my shoulders. I lay just 2 feet away from the man who had so meticulously planned my annihilation. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I could hear the quiet, rhythmic sound of his breathing. I didn't feel an ounce of fear. I only felt a deep, chilling anticipation. Literally chilling. The trap was set. The evidence was secure. The strategy was finalized. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to drift into a shallow, calculated sleep. Tomorrow morning, the sun would rise over Chicago, and I would wake up and play the role of the loving, unsuspecting wife one last time. I would smile at him over coffee. I would hold his hand in the back of the car and watch as he joyfully marched straight toward his own complete destruction. The morning arrived with the sharp blare of the alarm clock. Ethan was already on his feet, bustling around the bedroom with an almost irritating level of energy. He kissed me on the cheek, handed me a cup of coffee, and told me to get dressed because our private car was already waiting. I played my part beautifully. I stretched, gave him a sleepy, grateful smile, and told him how much I couldn't wait for this trip. I grabbed my leather tote from the closet, feeling the dense, solid weight of the black brick resting safely at the bottom, hidden under my laptop and a cashmere shawl. Ethan grabbed my black suitcase, carrying it down the stairs with exaggerated care. He thought he was carrying his golden ticket. He had no idea he was lugging an absolutely empty shell. We stepped out into the crisp Chicago morning. A luxury SUV with its engine running was already in our driveway. The driver got out to open the trunk, but Ethan insisted on loading my black suitcase himself. He placed it gently in the back, patting it with great satisfaction at the end. I watched him from the sidewalk, clutching my tote bag tightly to my chest, masking the cold anticipation with a radiant, vacation-ready smile. Ethan opened the back door for me. I slid onto the leather seat, and that's when I saw her. Jessica was sitting in the front passenger seat. She turned around, giving me a dazzling, lip-gloss shiny smile. "Good morning, Chloe," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Ethan mentioned it would be more efficient to take one car to the airport, since my flight to New York leaves around the same time as your flight to the Bahamas. I hope you don't mind." I forced my face to soften, adopting an expression of pleasant surprise. "Not at all, Jessica," I replied in a calm, light voice. That makes perfect sense. After all, we're all heading to the same place. Ethan slid into the back seat right next to me and slammed the heavy door shut. The SUV pulled away, beginning our journey to O'Hare. The inside of the car was initially stuffily quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the engine. The entire spatial dynamic was a masterpiece of betrayal. Ethan sat shoulder to shoulder with his wife, while his mistress sat just a few feet away in the front seat. I kept my eyes focused on the rearview mirror. I could clearly see Jessica's reflection in it. She wasn't looking at the road, she was looking at Ethan. Every few minutes, her eyes would flick to the mirror, catching his gaze. A barely perceptible, mocking smirk played on her lips. She was enjoying this. She loved the thrill of sitting in the same car with the clueless wife, sharing a secret, deadly joke with the man who was about to destroy my life. Ethan was reveling in it too. He reached over to me, took my hand, and intertwined his fingers with mine. "You look beautiful this morning, Chloe," he said, stroking the back of my hand with his thumb. "This trip is going to change everything for us. We'll leave all our heavy baggage here in Chicago and focus solely on our future." The dramatic irony of his words hung palpably in the narrow space of the SUV. He thought he was making a clever, double-meaning joke about leaving our marriage behind and me rotting in a jail cell. I looked at him, squeezing his hand tightly. "I completely agree, Ethan," I replied, matching his serious tone. "I feel so much lighter already. It's amazing how much better you feel when you finally get rid of all the things that were weighing you down." Jessica's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror for a split second. Her smile widened. She thought my response was pathetic, a desperate clinging to hope by a woman trying to save a doomed marriage. She turned her head slightly toward the passenger window, hiding a quiet snort. "Are you ready for that big board meeting in New York?" I asked Jessica, leaning forward slightly. "Ethan said you're handling some incredibly confidential financial forecasts. It must be a lot of pressure, carrying all that corporate weight all by yourself." Jessica shifted in her seat, adjusting her expensive designer scarf. "Oh, it's nothing I can't handle, Chloe. Ethan trusts me completely with his most valuable assets. I know exactly how to execute his plans." She glanced at Ethan in the mirror again, her eyes shining with malicious satisfaction. Ethan let out a low, rumbling laugh, patting me on the knee. "Jessica's a pro, Chloe. She always delivers exactly what I ask for, without leaving the slightest margin for error. That's why she's absolutely essential to my operations." The only thing missing was for them to high-five right in front of my face. The sheer arrogance required to mock me so openly was simply stunning. They felt invincible. They believed they were the predators, toying with their food just before the slaughter. I leaned back against the leather seat, placing my hand on the large leather tote bag on my lap. Through the thick material, my fingertips brushed against the hard outline of the black-taped package. "It's so important to have people you can trust around you," I murmured, looking out the window at the passing highway traffic. "Especially when you're dealing with things that could ruin your life if they ever saw the light of day. At the end of the day, you really have to be careful who you let carry your own baggage." The luxury SUV bounced slightly on a bump in the busy expressway. Ethan withdrew his hand to check a quick notification on his phone. "We're making great time," he announced. "We'll be at the VIP terminal in 20 minutes. The security lines there are a breeze. We'll all get through the gates today with no problem at all." I just smiled at my reflection in the dark window. He was completely right about one thing. Everything was about to change. Forever. The luxury SUV glided to a smooth stop in front of the glass and steel facade of the international terminal. A uniformed porter immediately approached the vehicle, but Ethan waved him off with a sharp, almost frantic gesture. He insisted on handling the luggage himself, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of my black suitcase. He pulled it from the trunk with such care, as if it contained the crown jewels. As soon as he carefully placed it on the concrete, Jessica retrieved her pristine Louis Vuitton roller bag, which glided silently across the sidewalk. I stepped out into the biting Chicago wind, clutching my heavy leather tote bag tightly at my side. The black brick of drugs rested safely at the bottom like an anchor, pulling me inexorably toward the grand finale. We passed through the sliding glass doors, escaping the chaotic crowds of the main departure hall. Ethan completely bypassed the standard check-in counters, leading us straight toward a frosted glass entrance to an exclusive first-class lounge. It was a sanctuary designed specifically for the elite, a place where the disgustingly rich could sip espresso and drink free champagne before facing the minor inconvenience of a priority security checkpoint located just outside the lounge exit. The heavy glass doors slid open, completely muffling the frantic airport noise. The lounge was enveloped in an atmosphere of hushed, luxurious privilege. Muted jazz flowed from invisible speakers. Businessmen in suits typed quietly on laptops while staff in perfectly pressed vests circulated with silver trays. Ethan chose a secluded spot in the far corner, surrounded by high frosted glass partitions that provided a strategic dose of privacy. He placed my black suitcase directly against the wall, keeping it perfectly within his line of sight. Jessica parked her designer luggage next to my leather armchair, casually abandoning it as she threw her trench coat over the armrest. Ethan sat down opposite me, his knee bouncing nervously. His facade of the relaxed romantic husband was beginning to crack under the crushing weight of his own conspiracy. He checked his watch again, then stared at the entrance to the priority security checkpoint, visible through the lounge's glass walls. In his mind, he was meticulously calculating the final steps of his execution. I sat completely still, maintaining a calm, unruffled expression, while my mind precisely mapped the entire geography of the room. I located the security cameras. I tracked the repetitive paths and movement patterns of the lounge staff. I measured the exact distance between my chair and Jessica's suitcase. 10 minutes passed in suffocating silence. The tension radiating from Ethan was so palpable it felt like a physical weight in the air. Suddenly, he pulled out his phone, stared at the completely blank screen, and took a sharp, feigned gasp of surprise. "It's the board from New York," he announced, his voice tight with artificially manufactured haste. "They must be reviewing the preliminary financial reports. I have to take this call before we go through security. It might take a few minutes." He stood up abruptly, pointing to a row of soundproof glass phone booths on the opposite side of the lounge. "Order yourself a mimosa, Chloe," he instructed, forcing a tense smile. "I'll be right back, and then we'll head straight to the gate." I watched him walk away at a brisk pace, his back rigid, a man marching off to a tense conversation with a deadline. He entered a soundproof booth and turned his back to the seating area, pressing the phone to his ear in a pathetic pantomime of a corporate crisis. I was completely alone with Jessica. She sat opposite me, scrolling through her social media with an expression of profound boredom. She didn't even bother to make conversation. In her mind, I was already a ghost. I was just a naive, disposable obstacle standing between her and a stolen fortune. She sighed heavily, locked her phone screen, and tossed it into her purse. "I need to touch up my lipstick," Jessica announced, not even looking at me. "This dry air in here is an absolute nightmare." She stood up, smoothing the creases on her absurdly expensive silk blouse. She didn't take her Louis Vuitton roller bag with her. Why would she? She was leaving it in the care of a woman she perceived as completely harmless. A woman so painfully oblivious she hadn't even noticed her own husband slipping through her fingers. Jessica turned on her heel and walked confidently toward the luxury restrooms located down a short, curved hallway near the lounge entrance. I watched her silhouette disappear around the corner. I shifted my gaze back to the soundproof booth. Ethan was still facing the wall, gesturing animatedly in a conversation with some imaginary board of directors. I was completely alone. Adrenaline shot into my bloodstream like a violent electrical surge. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force it threatened to shatter my chest. Tunnel vision completely cut me off from the soft jazz, the murmur of conversations, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The entire world narrowed down to that pristine designer suitcase standing exactly 1 foot from my right foot. My internal clock began a merciless, unforgiving countdown. I had exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes before Jessica finished reapplying her makeup. 3 minutes before Ethan ended his theatrical phone call. 3 minutes to conduct the most dangerous transaction of my life. I did not panic. The forensic accountant took absolute control of my nervous system. I operate on split-second timing daily, in incredibly narrow windows, in all the empty spaces where greedy people become vulnerable. I took a deep, silent breath, filling my lungs with oxygen. I casually shifted my weight, moving to the very edge of the leather armchair. I unzipped my large tote bag. I plunged my hand deep into the dark interior, pushing past my laptop and cashmere shawl. My fingers brushed against the rough, unmistakable texture of the black electrical tape. The brick of synthetic drugs was heavy, cold, and ready. I tightened my grip on it, preparing to pull the trigger on the trap that was about to tear their lives apart, piece by piece. My 3-minute window was closing fast. The lounge remained calm. No one was looking in my direction. The business travelers were completely absorbed in their screens. The staff was busy at the buffet. The scene was wonderfully, perfectly empty. I glanced one last time down the hallway to the restrooms. Empty! I looked at the soundproof booth. Ethan was still facing the wall. The countdown ticked mercilessly in my head. 2 minutes and 45 seconds left. The stakes had never been higher, and my hands had never been so steady and sure. I pulled the black package from my bag, keeping it low, hidden under the folds of my long coat. The moment of absolute destruction had officially begun. I slid my weight out of the leather armchair and onto the thick-piled carpet in one fluid motion. To the businessmen across the lounge, I probably just looked like a woman bending down to adjust her shoe. But from my perspective, hidden behind the frosted glass partition, I had complete, unhindered access to the pristine Louis Vuitton suitcase, abandoned carelessly on the carpet. 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. The designer luggage practically mocked me with its interlocking monogram pattern. Jessica had placed the suitcase with the main zipper facing outward, completely unsecured. She was so confident in her safety, so utterly consumed by the delusion of her impending tropical victory, that she hadn't even bothered to snap shut the small brass padlock dangling from the side handle. I reached out and grasped the gold custom-made zipper pulls. The metal was ice-cold against my skin. I slid the zippers apart. The luxury hardware separated with zero resistance, opening in absolute silence. The inside of Jessica's suitcase hit me with an overwhelming scent of expensive floral perfume and fresh leather. My eyes scanned the contents with the swift, cool efficiency of an auditor analyzing a physical ledger. She had packed with almost sloppy arrogance. Tangled silk camisoles lay chaotically on top of designer swimsuits. A velvet jewelry pouch was tossed brazenly right near the top. I pushed my hand through her disgustingly expensive clothes, digging deep toward the bottom frame of the suitcase. 2 minutes left. My fingers searched the material along the base of the luggage. I needed a compartment deep enough to hide a 3-pound brick of synthetic drugs and evidence of corporate treason. I found an extra zipper running along the spine of the suitcase. It was an inner lining pocket, meant for storing damp clothing or shoes. I grabbed the small plastic pull tab and yanked it open. The space inside was perfectly empty. I lifted the tape-wrapped package from the folds of my long coat. The brick felt exponentially heavier now that it was fully exposed. It contained a life sentence. It contained the $15 million Ethan had siphoned from his company. It contained the fabricated digital emails designed to bury me in a foreign prison. I didn't hesitate for a second. I shoved the heavy black package deep into the inner cavity of Jessica's designer suitcase. I pressed the brick flat against the hard polycarbonate spine, maneuvering the corners to fit perfectly into the spaces by the wheels. I pressed down with my palms on the heavy plastic, feeling the vacuum-sealed drugs settle into the very foundation of the luggage. I smoothed the inner nylon lining over the package, making sure no unnatural bulges protruded upward. It was a flawless fit. The weight of my husband's betrayal had been officially transferred. 1 minute and 20 seconds left. I grabbed the inner zipper and slid it shut, safely sealing the drugs and the encrypted flash drive in darkness. I quickly rearranged her tangled silk nightgowns, tossing them back over the bottom lining in the exact same chaotic pattern she had left them. I pulled the 2 gold external zippers together, completely closing the Louis Vuitton suitcase. I adjusted the handles to match the exact same angle Jessica had left them. I slid back into my leather armchair, my heart pounding a violent rhythm against my ribs. My hands were trembling slightly from the massive adrenaline dump. I wiped my palms on my pants, grabbed the stem of my mimosa glass, and took a deep, stabilizing breath. The physical exchange had taken exactly 75 seconds, 1 minute remaining. I glanced across the spacious lounge. Ethan was still trapped in the soundproof glass phone booth. He was turned with his back to the seating area, nodding with engagement, pointing a finger in the air, selling his fabricated corporate crisis to an empty receiver. He looked so powerful in his tailored suit. He had no idea his entire future had just been transferred into the luggage of the woman he was sleeping with. Then, a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the muffled hum of the lounge. Click, clack, click. The unmistakable sound of designer heels hitting the polished marble of the hallway leading from the restrooms. The footsteps were moving quickly, sharply, and with incredible purpose. My internal clock screamed. 45 seconds. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the frosted glass partitions. Someone was walking straight toward our secluded corner. I crossed my legs, adjusted the collar of my blouse, and lifted the rim of the mimosa glass to my lips. I regulated my breathing, forcing my chest to rise and fall in a slow, relaxed tempo. I stared blankly at the digital departure board mounted on the far wall, the absolute picture of a bored wife waiting for her husband. The footsteps rounded the corner. Jessica swept into our seating area. Her lipstick was flawlessly applied in a vibrant, aggressive shade of red. Not a single hair was out of place in her perfect hairdo. She moved with the arrogant stride of a woman who firmly believed she had already won the war. She glanced down at her Louis Vuitton suitcase, lying on the carpet. It looked completely untouched. She had absolutely no idea that her pristine luggage was now a ticking time bomb, ready to level her life. Jessica sank heavily into the chair across from me. She crossed her legs and picked up her phone, completely ignoring my presence. She let out a quiet, theatrical sigh of inconvenience, tapping her manicured nails on the screen. "Ethan sure is taking his time, isn't he?" she muttered, her eyes glued to the device. "You'd think the board could manage without him for a few hours. He just works way too hard." I lowered my mimosa glass, letting the cool crystal rest against my knee. The irony of her statement was suffocating. I looked directly at her perfectly contoured face. I thought about the heavy, black package resting just inches beneath her designer shoes. I thought about the armed CBP officers waiting on the other side of the security checkpoint. I gave her a sweet, chilling smile. "He's incredibly dedicated," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly polite. "But don't worry, Jessica. I have a feeling Ethan is about to take a very long, very permanent vacation from all his corporate responsibilities. He just has to get through security first." Jessica finally looked up from her phone. She met my gaze, and her eyes narrowed for a split second. She sensed something strange in my tone, a subtle, razor-sharp edge she couldn't quite identify. But her arrogance quickly drowned out those instincts. She smirked, turning her attention back to the screen. "I sure hope so, Chloe," she said dismissively. "I think we're all ready for a change of scenery." I took another sip of my drink, letting the citrus and champagne burn the back of my throat. I stared at the Louis Vuitton suitcase on the floor, then looked up at the soundproof booth. Ethan was just hanging up, turning around with a triumphant, self-satisfied smile on his face. He stepped out of the booth and started walking toward us, completely unaware that he was marching straight into a slaughterhouse. The 3-minute window had just closed. The trap was locked. It was time to step up to the guillotine. Ethan approached our seating area with long, quick strides. He slid his phone into the pocket of his tailored suit and clapped his hands together. The sharp sound echoed in our quiet corner. "Crisis averted," he announced, his voice a little too loud and tight with forced relief. "The board in New York accepted my preliminary calculations. We're all clear." He looked at me, then glanced quickly at my black suitcase, leaning against the frosted glass partition. His gaze lingered on the zipper for a fraction of a second too long. "Ready to go, honey?" I stood up smoothly, smoothing the creases on my pants. "Absolutely ready." Jessica rose from her chair, grabbing the handle of her Louis Vuitton suitcase, the suitcase that now carried a multi-year prison sentence hidden deep in its lining. She adjusted her designer trench coat and gave Ethan a short, conspiratorial smile. "Let's get going," she said. "I've got a long flight ahead of me." Ethan reached for my black suitcase, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle. He lifted it with a sudden, jerky motion, putting in too much force to compensate for the weight he expected to feel. A flash of confusion crossed his face as the suitcase came up much more easily than it should have. The 3-pound brick of drugs was gone, but his brain hadn't yet processed the physical discrepancy. He adjusted his grip, blaming it on the adrenaline pumping through his veins. I picked up my leather tote bag, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped into the aisle. We walked out of the first-class lounge and blended into the bustling crowd of the international terminal. The walk to the priority security checkpoint was only 200 yards, but the psychological distance felt like a marathon. I watched Ethan closely during that march. His facade of the relaxed husband was rapidly disintegrating. A thick sheen of sweat broke out on the back of his neck, glistening under the bright terminal lights. He was walking far too quickly. His long legs devoured the polished concrete floor, forcing Jessica and me to speed up just to keep pace with him. He kept looking over his shoulder, making sure I was right behind him. He wanted to keep his prize safely in sight. Jessica trailed slightly to my left. The polyurethane wheels of her Louis Vuitton suitcase hummed a steady, rhythmic melody against the floor. Every single rotation of those wheels was bringing $15 million in stolen company funds and 3 pounds of synthetic drugs closer to law enforcement. She was muttering under her breath about the dry airport air, completely oblivious to the fact that she was, at that moment, the most valuable target in the entire building. The contrast between my husband's frantic energy and my absolute icy calm was striking. I kept up with his urgent pace step for step, but my breathing remained perfectly even. I was like a spectator watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion. Ethan was rushing headlong toward his own execution, dragging his mistress along as collateral damage. He thought he was making the final move in a chess game he had rigged from the start. He had no idea the board had already been flipped upside down. The priority security checkpoint loomed ahead. The area was cordoned off with thick velvet ropes and staffed by CBP officers with stern faces. Behind the check-in stations, massive gray X-ray scanners swallowed luggage on heavy black conveyor belts. Ethan practically shoved his boarding pass and ID at the officer manning the gate. He was bouncing nervously on the balls of his feet, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his cheeks were twitching. I handed over my documents with a polite, light smile, offering a pleasant greeting. The officer nodded, compared my passport to my ticket, and waved us through. We entered the security zone. The air smelled of ozone, floor polish, and the nervous sweat of hurried passengers. The surrounding noise was a chaotic symphony of rattling plastic bins, sharp commands from the staff, and the low mechanical hum of the scanning machines. Ethan bypassed the empty queue and aggressively steered us toward a specific conveyor belt at the far right end. He wanted a lane with a clear, unobstructed view of the monitor. He wanted a front row seat to my annihilation. He grabbed 3 gray plastic bins from a stack and slammed them onto the metal rollers with a crash. He turned to me, his eyes wide, pupils dilated with manic anticipation. "Go ahead, Chloe," he urged, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed excitement. "You go first. Put your things on the belt. Let's get through this quickly so we can finally relax." He physically stepped aside, blocking Jessica from moving forward, ensuring that I would be the one standing directly in front of the machine. He positioned himself perfectly to see the officer's face when my black suitcase entered the scanner. I approached the stainless steel rollers. The moment had finally arrived. The culmination of months of monstrous psychological abuse, obsessive financial tracking, and meticulous, late-night planning. It all came down to the next 60 seconds. I didn't hesitate. I moved with fluid grace. I took off my coat and placed it neatly in the first gray bin. I put my heavy leather tote in the second, making sure to pull out my laptop first and place it in a separate container as per regulations. Then, I reached for the handle of my black suitcase. Ethan was hovering just inches from my shoulder. His breath was shallow and ragged. He was practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of fear and impending victory. I lifted the black suitcase and placed it squarely on the conveyor belt. The thick material settled onto the rubber rollers with a dull thud. I glanced at Ethan. His eyes were fixed on the luggage with a terrifying, almost ravenous intensity. He was waiting for the sirens to wail. He was waiting for the heavy hands of law enforcement to tackle me to the cold floor. I turned my attention back to the security lane. I stood completely still, letting my arms fall loosely at my sides. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. I watched as the thick black rubber flaps of the X-ray machine parted, swallowing my suitcase into the dark scanning tunnel. I didn't look away. I waited for the machine to do its job, knowing with absolute, blood-chilling certainty that nothing would appear on the screen but silk dresses and linen pants. The black rubber flaps completely consumed my luggage. I kept my gaze fixed on the backlit monitor suspended just above the officer's station. The screen displayed a vibrant, shifting landscape of colors as the internal contents of my suitcase were laid bare by the penetrating radiation. Bright shades of blue indicated the metal zippers and hardware. Dense oranges and greens represented the organic matter of my neatly arranged silk dresses and linen pants. Ethan was standing so close to the conveyor belt that the jacket of his tailored suit was brushing against the stainless steel edge. He was leaning forward, his neck craned at an unnatural angle to get a clear view of the monitors. He was waiting for a massive, incredibly dense block of orange to appear on the screen. He was waiting for that unmistakable rectangular void that would indicate a densely packed brick of synthetic drugs. He held his breath. His entire body was like a compressed spring, wound so tight I could practically see the adrenaline pulsing in the veins on his neck. The CBP officer stared blankly at the screen. He held a half-empty bottle of water in one hand, his eyes glazed over with the profound boredom of someone who had already stared at 1,000 identical suitcases that same morning. The conveyor belt hummed its steady, mechanical tune. The glowing image of my luggage scrolled smoothly across the monitor. There was no rectangular void. There was no dense, anomalous block of organic matter hidden in the lining. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The officer blinked lazily, took a sip of water, and looked away from the screen. He didn't hit the red emergency stop button. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't signal to the armed officers standing nearby. The thick rubber flaps on the exit side of the machine parted, and my elegant black suitcase rolled out into the bright light of the terminal, completely untouched. I turned away from the conveyor belt and walked confidently toward the advanced body scanner. I handed my boarding pass to the officer guarding the entrance. I nodded politely and stepped inside the cylindrical machine. I placed my feet precisely on the yellow-painted footprints. I raised my arms above my head, clasping my hands in the designated position. The scanner's mechanical arm whirred to life, rotating swiftly around my body. I closed my eyes for a split second, reveling in the pristine, absolute cleanliness of my current state. I had absolutely nothing on me. Besides my ID and boarding pass, I was legally and physically untouchable. "Please exit," the officer instructed, gesturing toward the exit. I stepped out of the scanner. A small monitor attached to the machine displayed a solid, comforting green screen. No anomalies detected. No additional manual screening required. I was completely clean. I walked casually to the stainless steel luggage retrieval area, where my plastic bins and black suitcase were already waiting. I slipped my shoes back on. I scooped my laptop from the plastic tray and smoothly slid it into my heavy leather tote bag. Then, I wrapped my fingers around the telescopic handle of my black suitcase and pulled it off the rollers. I looked across the security line at my husband. Ethan hadn't moved an inch. He was frozen in place, staring at the empty space on the conveyor belt where my suitcase had been just moments before. His hands were gripping the edge of the metal table with such force that his knuckles were completely white. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving it a morbid, ashen gray. He looked like a man who had just witnessed the laws of physics turn upside down before his very eyes. His reality was once again shattering into a million sharp pieces. He looked at the board officer, then back at the empty conveyor belt, until finally his panicked gaze shot across the checkpoint and met mine. I gave him a gentle, reassuring wave. Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest began to heave in rapid, shallow spasms. He was hyperventilating. The meticulous, arrogant corporate CFO was having a system meltdown in the middle of a priority security line. His brain was desperately trying to process the impossible equation. He knew exactly what he had done at 2:00 a.m. He vividly remembered the feel of the utility knife cutting through the nylon of my luggage. He remembered the dense, powerful weight of the package wrapped in black tape. He remembered burying it, hiding it, sealing my fate with his own two hands. And yet, the suitcase had passed through the CBP check without triggering a single alarm. I could see in his dilated eyes the frantic, terrified calculations galloping through his mind. Had the X-ray scanner malfunctioned? Statistically impossible. Had the officer simply missed it? A package of that size would have been glaringly obvious even to a blind man. Or had he somehow forgotten to pack it? No. The memory was seared into his brain. He had felt the package in his hands. He had zipped the lock. The only logical conclusion that remained was so terrifying, so utterly devastating to his sense of control, that his mind simply refused to accept it. The package had vanished. Ethan took a stumbling half-step backward, bumping hard into the person standing directly behind him. He didn't even turn to apologize. A drop of cold sweat broke free from his hairline and traced a slow, painful path down his pale cheek. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his wilting frame. With a trembling hand, he reached up to loosen his silk tie, desperately trying to force some oxygen into his constricted lungs. "Please move forward," a female officer snapped, pointing impatiently at the empty space in front of Ethan. "You're holding up the line. Please put your items in the bin and proceed through the metal detector." Ethan jumped at the sharp command, his shoulders jerking violently. He looked completely lost. Blinded by panic, he began fumbling in his pockets, pulling out his wallet, his keys, his obscenely expensive smartphone, tossing everything into a gray plastic bin with clumsy, uncoordinated movements. His hands were shaking so badly that a few coins spilled over the edge and clattered loudly onto the stainless steel table. "Sir," the officer repeated, her voice dripping with irritation. "Your luggage. Please put your luggage on the belt." Right behind him, Jessica let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of annoyance. "Ethan, come on," she muttered, shoving her pristine Louis Vuitton suitcase forward so hard it hit the back of his calves. "What's taking you so long? You're blocking both of us. Just move your bins so I can finally get my things through." Ethan didn't answer her. He simply couldn't get a word out. He was completely consumed by the blinding panic of a predator who suddenly realizes he's standing in the middle of a trap with absolutely no victim in sight. With jerky, mechanical shoves, he pushed his briefcase and travel bag onto the conveyor belt. He stumbled toward the metal detector, not looking where he was going. His eyes were completely glazed over, his mind spinning out of control. I stood patiently at the very end of the retrieval area, gripping the handle of my 100% clean suitcase. I watched as Jessica lifted her heavy designer bag and placed it on the metal rollers. I watched as she pushed it toward the dark, gaping maw of the scanner tunnel. Ethan stumbled through the metal detector. His gaze was locked on my face. He was desperately searching for an answer, a clue, a shred of understanding. I just tilted my head slightly, giving him that same sweet, completely oblivious smile. The game was no longer his. The executioner had finally arrived. Jessica stepped into the advanced scanner with an exaggerated sigh, perfectly suited to a woman deeply disgusted by the fact that the rules for ordinary citizens applied to her. She smoothed a hand over her perfectly coiffed hair, retrieved her designer trench coat from a gray plastic bin, and slipped it over her shoulders with theatrical flair. She didn't look at Ethan. She certainly didn't look at me. Her entire focus was on the exit. She wanted to escape this tedious security check as quickly as possible and get to her luxurious international flight. Her pristine Louis Vuitton roller bag was next in line. It glided smoothly along the stainless steel rollers, hit the rubber guard, and was swallowed by the dark tunnel of the X-ray scanner. I kept my gaze fixed on the CBP officer operating the monitor. Just seconds before, this man had been the epitome of bureaucratic apathy, sipping water and staring blankly at an endless parade of travel pillows and toiletry bags. In the split second that Jessica's designer luggage scrolled across his screen, his entire indifferent posture completely disintegrated. He stopped chewing his gum. His spine straightened like a rod, pressing firmly against the back of his ergonomic chair. He leaned forward so far his nose almost touched the monitor glass. His hand flew across the control panel, keying in a rapid sequence of commands to sharpen the image, changing the contrast and density settings. Whatever he was seeing, it was massive, anomalous, and terrifyingly dense. He didn't hesitate for a second. His hand shot forward and slammed down on the large red button mounted on the side of the console. The uninterrupted, monotonous hum of the conveyor belt immediately ceased. The stainless steel rollers locked up with a violent, mechanical screech that echoed sharply through the entire terminal. And then the alarm started. It wasn't a quiet, discreet notification. It was a roaring, deafening siren that cut through the hubbub of conversations like a physical weapon. Strobe lights, mounted on the ceiling directly above our security lane, began to flash in rapid, blinding intervals. The mundane routine of the checkpoint had completely evaporated, replaced in a split second by the rigid, electrified atmosphere of a serious national security threat. Jessica jumped, startled by the sudden noise. She looked up at the flashing lights, her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of pure outrage. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, tapping her designer shoe aggressively on the floor. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Jessica snapped, her voice cutting through the wail. She glared at the officer behind the monitor. "Excuse me. Please turn off that noise. My flight is in an hour, and you're holding up my luggage. I have VIP passenger status. This is simply outrageous." She genuinely believed it was just some minor bureaucratic error. She thought her bottle of expensive perfume had spilled, or that her curling iron had set off a false alarm. Her arrogance was so deeply ingrained that the concept of real, unmitigated danger hadn't even broken through to her consciousness. She was tapping her finger on her phone screen, pulling up the airline app, ready to show them her boarding pass and demand to speak to the shift supervisor. Ethan, however, was now experiencing a completely different reality. He was standing just a yard away from her and was literally, physically falling apart. When the conveyor belt stopped, his whole body just froze. He looked at the X-ray monitor, then at the dark opening of the machine where Jessica's luggage was trapped, and finally, he looked back at me. The mathematical equation in his brain finally resolved into a logical whole. The impossible variables suddenly fit together. The heavy 3-pound brick of synthetic drugs and the encrypted flash drive, with $15 million in stolen money, hadn't vanished into thin air. They had simply changed addresses. I maintained my delicate, unwavering smile, returning his gaze with an absolute, blood-chilling calm. Ethan looked like a man who had just been pushed out of a plane without a parachute. His complexion had changed from ashen gray to a sickly, translucent white. He raised trembling fingers, desperately clawing at the knot of his silk tie. He yanked it down with such force that he tore off the top button of his obscenely expensive shirt. He needed oxygen, but his lungs were completely blocked. He took a shaky step back, his knees buckling slightly, his polished leather shoes slipping on the smooth floor. "Ethan, do something!" Jessica snapped, turning to him. "Tell them who you are. Tell them we're flying first class and that they need to give me my bag back right now." Ethan couldn't get a word out. His mouth opened and closed in rapid, silent gasps, like a fish pulled from the ocean and thrown onto a burning pier. He clutched his chest, right over his heart. His breathing had been reduced to shallow, ragged wheezes. He knew exactly what was inside that suitcase, and he knew exactly whose name was attached to it. The life sentence he had so meticulously planned for his wife was now sitting squarely in his mistress's lap. And because they were traveling together, because he had paid for her ticket with his corporate credit card, the blast radius of this explosion was about to incinerate him right along with her. "Clear the lane. Clear this area now." A commanding shout came from the end of the checkpoint. The regular officers instantly backed away, creating a wide, protective perimeter. Heavy, synchronized footsteps thudded on the concrete floor, moving with terrifying speed. A specialized CBP tactical team charged toward the scanner. They were dressed in dark, heavy tactical gear, their faces grim and intensely focused. But it wasn't the armed officers themselves that made the crowd of waiting passengers hold their breath and start to back away. It was the K9 unit. The same German Shepherd that had alerted on Jessica's suitcase in the priority line earlier was here again. And this time, the animal was absolutely furious. The handler could barely hold on to the heavy leather leash as the dog strained forward, its claws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth floor. The dog dragged the officer straight to the stopped conveyor belt. This time it didn't sit. It threw itself at the machine, barking with a wild, deafening intensity, its front paws frantically clawing at the rubber flaps, desperately trying to get to the Louis Vuitton suitcase trapped inside. Jessica finally stopped tapping on her phone screen. Her indignant posture completely collapsed as the powerful, aggressive animal barked furiously at her property. She took a terrified step back, her eyes widening in genuine alarm. "What is going on?" she stammered, her high-pitched voice cracking. "Why is that dog doing that? Get it away from my things! Don't take another step!" A tactical officer barked, pointing a stern finger straight at her chest. Ethan was now having a full-blown panic attack. His legs finally gave out. He crashed into a stack of empty gray plastic bins, sending them clattering across the control zone. He slid down the wall, hitting the floor hard. He pulled his knees to his chin, wrapped his arms around his head, and began to rock back and forth. The sophisticated, arrogant corporate CFO had been reduced to a hyperventilating, terrified child. He was watching his entire universe turn to ash, and he knew with perfect clarity that there was absolutely no escape. I stood quietly at the very edge of the luggage retrieval area. My posture was fully relaxed, my hands folded neatly over the handle of my completely clean suitcase. I watched as the tactical team swarmed around Jessica's bag. I watched as the dog continued its frantic positive indication. I watched as my husband gasped for air like a fish on the cold airport floor. The execution was proceeding exactly, 100% according to plan. And the explosion was really just beginning. The tactical team secured the area with breathtaking efficiency. Passengers in adjacent lines were pushed back, their complaints instantly silenced by the hard glares of heavily armed officers. The air in the terminal grew thick, charged with the heavy, electric tension of an active law enforcement operation. The German Shepherd was finally pulled back, its handler struggling to control the animal's aggressive lunges toward Jessica's suitcase. Then the crowd parted. A tall, imposing figure strode through the security line. He wore the dark navy uniform of a CBP captain. The gold insignia on his collar gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His mere presence commanded an absolute, immediate silence. It was a silence born of respect, authority, and undeniable power. It was Jamal, my brother-in-law. Jamal, my younger sister Rachel's husband. A man who had built his career on an unwavering, iron foundation of integrity. He was a force of nature in his agency, famous for breaking up smuggling rings with ruthless precision. He didn't play politics. He didn't bend the rules. He was the kind of officer who would arrest his own mother without blinking if she tried to skip a customs declaration. He walked directly to the stopped conveyor belt. His dark eyes scanned the scene, taking in the sight of the hyperventilating Ethan on the floor, the terrified Jessica cowering by the metal table, and finally, Me. Our eyes met. Jamal didn't smile, didn't offer a comforting wave, or any kind of family greeting. His expression remained completely stoic, a mask of pure, professional authority. But in the microscopic fraction of a second, as our gazes crossed, I saw it, a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken sign that the chessboard was set, the pieces were in place, and the endgame had officially begun. He broke eye contact and turned his piercing gaze on Jessica. She flinched, pressing her back flat against the stainless steel table, her obscenely expensive trench coat sliding off her shoulders. "Captain," the security officer said, his voice trembling slightly, "we have a positive K9 indication on this bag. Passenger claims ownership." Jamal approached the Louis Vuitton suitcase. He didn't ask for permission. He grabbed the gold zipper pulls and yanked the main compartment wide open. He didn't bother digging through the designer clothes. His large hands went straight down, to the very bottom of the bag. He felt the unnatural stiffness along the spine. He found the inner zipper, the one I had closed just 10 minutes earlier. He unzipped it. The heavy, black-taped package lay right there, nestled between the structural ribs of the suitcase. Jamal reached inside and pulled the 3-pound brick of synthetic drugs out into the bright light of the terminal. He held it up, examining the meticulous packaging. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a hunter who had just cornered his prey. "So this is your bag?" Jamal demanded, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that echoed through the quiet checkpoint. Jessica's jaw trembled. She looked at the black package, then at Jamal, her eyes wide with the purest terror. She raised a shaking finger and aimed it straight at Ethan, who was still crumpled on the floor, gasping for air. "He's my boss," Jessica stammered, her voice cracking. "He's the one who bought my ticket. He told me to take this suitcase. I don't know what that is." He packed it. Jamal turned slowly, looking down at Ethan. The corporate CFO was just a pathetic, broken shell of a man. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face shone with a clammy, cold sweat. He looked up at Jamal, his eyes darting frantically between the imposing CBP officer and the black package of drugs. "Sir," Jamal said, his tone completely devoid of emotion. "Is this your luggage?" Ethan tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. He fell back onto the plastic bins, his hands desperately clutching his own chest. His mind was completely disintegrating. The arrogant, calculated embezzler had vanished, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. He looked at Jessica, then at the package, until finally his panicked gaze jumped to me. I stood there, a picture of calm, unflappable innocence. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible shake of my head. It was the physical embodiment of his own favorite sentence. "You're losing touch with reality." Ethan stared at me, his eyes widening in a sudden, terrifying epiphany. He saw through the trap. He saw the cold, calculated precision of my revenge. It dawned on him that his brilliant, absolutely foolproof plan to send his wife to a foreign prison had just been turned against him with lethal efficiency. The absolute terror of the situation completely broke his mind. His rational corporate facade evaporated, leaving only blind, primal panic. "No!" Ethan screamed, his voice raw and hysterical. "No! This is a mistake!" He scrambled to his knees, aiming a trembling finger at the black package in Jamal's hand. He had completely lost his self-preservation instinct. Panic had completely suppressed his survival senses. He just wanted the nightmare to end, and in his immense desperation, he made the most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. "That's impossible!" Ethan shrieked, his face contorted in absolute horror. "It was supposed to be in my wife's suitcase." The entire checkpoint froze. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and profound. The CBP officers stared at him in disbelief. Jessica covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with shock. The waiting passengers in the adjacent lines held their breath. Ethan had just confessed. He had just testified out loud, in front of a dozen officers and countless witnesses, that he intended to plant 3 pounds of synthetic drugs in his wife's luggage. He had just handed them the entire case on a silver platter. Jamal didn't even blink. His expression remained incredibly stoic, but I could see the quiet, dangerous satisfaction burning in his dark eyes. He slowly lowered the black package, placing it on the metal table. He reached up with his hand and tapped the small black body camera mounted in the center of his chest. "Thank you for your confession, sir," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a quiet, terrifying growl. He signaled to the tactical officer standing behind him, "Hands behind your back. You're both under arrest for international drug trafficking." Two armed officers immediately moved forward. They grabbed Ethan by the arms, roughly and with unrelenting force, hauling him to his feet. They pressed him against the stainless steel table, twisting his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut, echoing through the terminal, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Jessica started screaming. It was a high, hysterical wail as another officer grabbed her by the arms. She fought the grip, kicking and thrashing, begging them to let her go. Ethan didn't fight at all. He went completely limp. His eyes glazed over, his spirit utterly broken. He stared at me as they dragged him away, his face a mask of absolute, unmitigated terror. I stood quietly at the edge of the retrieval area, my hands neatly clasped on the handle of my clean suitcase. I watched as they led my husband and his mistress away in handcuffs. The explosion was complete, and the execution was simply flawless. The reality of a drug bust by federal agents isn't a cinematic event filled with a dramatic soundtrack or slow-motion heroism. It all happens with a brutal, almost suffocating speed. Jamal stood like a statue carved from obsidian, the heavy black-taped package resting securely in his wide hand. The gold captain's insignia on his uniform collar caught the harsh light of the terminal's fluorescent fixtures. He didn't break eye contact with Jessica. The young executive assistant was pressing herself so hard against the metal inspection table that her knuckles had turned completely white. Jessica looked at the vacuum-sealed brick of drugs, then down at her own pristine designer luggage. The mathematical equation had finally connected in her brain as well. She was standing in the middle of an international airport with wholesale quantities of synthetic drugs hidden inside her personal property. She opened her mouth, and a sound devoid of all human dignity tore from her throat. It was a piercing, vibrating scream of pure, authentic terror. "I've never seen that before," Jessica sobbed. Her manicured hands trembled violently as she aimed a quivering finger straight at Ethan. "He's my boss. He bought my ticket. He insisted on loading the car himself this morning. He put it in there. I'm just his assistant. He's trying to frame me. Please, you have to believe me. I don't know what it is." Jamal didn't even flinch. He offered her not an ounce of sympathy. He turned his heavy, piercing gaze down to the floor, where Ethan was currently choking on his own self-made panic. Ethan was huddled at the base of the scanning machine, his obscenely expensive tailored jacket covered in gray dust from the airport floor. He was clutching his chest, greedily gasping for air in shallow, violent heaves that did nothing to fill his lungs. He looked up at Jamal, then at the hysterical Jessica, and finally, his bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I stood exactly where I had been. My posture was perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the telescopic handle of my clean suitcase. I didn't throw him a life raft. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I offered him the exact same crushing silence he had used against me for the past year. Ethan's mind simply could not process the failure of his own genius. He was the powerful CFO. He was the smartest guy in the boardroom. He had orchestrated the perfect corporate embezzlement and the perfect marital execution. The cognitive dissonance he experienced seeing the executioner's blade speeding toward his own neck completely shattered his entire psychological structure. The rational, calculated corporate director died on that linoleum floor, leaving behind only a terrified, cornered animal. Desperation finally smothered every survival instinct he possessed. He crawled forward on all fours, completely ignoring the tactical officers who, at his sudden, unpredictable movement, immediately placed their hands on their holstered weapons. He aimed a trembling, sweaty finger at the black brick resting in Jamal's hand. "That's impossible!" Ethan screamed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal that echoed off the vaulted terminal ceilings. "That wasn't supposed to be there. It was supposed to be in my wife's suitcase." The entire checkpoint plunged into a silence so deep it resembled a true vacuum. The murmuring passengers, the rattling of plastic bins, the ambient airport announcements, it all instantly evaporated. Every single person nearby turned to stare at the man on the floor. Jessica stopped crying. She stared, jaw agape, at the man she had been sleeping with for so long. In that terrifying second, it dawned on her that he had never intended to protect her. He had planned from the beginning to use her as bait and a shield in case his operation went sideways. The grand romance, the stays in luxury hotels, the expensive jewelry, it was all just an advance payment for her role as his collateral damage. Jamal slowly lowered the package onto the metal inspection table. His face was a mask of cool, relentless state authority. He reached up with a steady hand and firmly tapped the small, square body camera mounted in the center of his tactical vest. A tiny red light blinked steadily, confirming that the device was actively recording every single word spoken at that checkpoint. "Thank you for your confession, sir," Jamal said, his deep voice resonating with an absolute terrifying finality. "Hands behind your back." The command broke the spell. The tactical officers descended on Ethan like ravenous wolves. They grabbed him by the arms, hauling him up from the floor with zero regard for his expensive tailored suit. They pressed his chest flat against the stainless steel inspection table, right next to the package of drugs. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs securely fastening around his wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Two female CBP officers stepped forward, twisting Jessica's hands behind her back. She didn't fight them. She just stood there, openly weeping, mascara running in dark, jagged streams down her pale cheeks. The pristine designer luggage she had been so incredibly proud of just moments before was now being tagged and bagged as state's evidence. Jamal stood directly in front of Ethan. He leaned in slightly, ensuring his voice would be perfectly recorded by the microphone on his vest. "You have the right to remain silent," Jamal began, reciting the Miranda rights with blood-chilling precision. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you by the court." Ethan was hyperventilating, his cheek pressed hard against the cold metal table. He craned his neck, straining against the iron grip of the tactical officers, desperately searching for me in the crowd of uniforms. "Chloe?" he begged, tears mixing with the thick sweat running down his face. "Chloe, tell them. Tell them I'm innocent. Please, you have to help me. Tell them this is some kind of mistake." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I stopped just before the cordon formed by the tactical team. I looked down at the man who had spent long months trying to convince me I was losing my mind. The man who had stolen $15 million and planned for me to rot in a foreign prison while he drank champagne on a tropical island. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice to a sharp whisper that only he and Jamal could hear. "You're just imagining things, Ethan," I said quietly, locking my eyes on his terrified gaze. "You're losing touch with reality." The color completely drained from his face. His eyes rolled back slightly, as the absolute horror of his own reality finally and utterly crushed his spirit. Jamal signaled to the officers. They lifted Ethan and began marching him through the terminal. The crowd of delayed passengers parted before them like the Red Sea. Hundreds of people held up their smartphones, recording as the wealthy, arrogant corporate executive was hauled away in absolute finite disgrace. Jessica walked right behind him, her head bowed in deep shame. The flashing red and blue strobe lights from the checkpoint illuminated the departure hall, casting long, chaotic shadows on the walls. The sound of their shuffling steps faded into the distance, drowned out by the insistent whispers of the surrounding crowd, who were already uploading their recordings to social media. A profound sense of unimaginable lightness settled on my shoulders. The heavy, suffocating anxiety I had been carrying for so many months evaporated into the sterile airport air. My husband had built a cage designed to imprison me forever, but in the end, he had walked into it himself and voluntarily handed me the key. I picked up my leather tote bag, adjusted my coat, and prepared for the final phase of his destruction. The stark, windowless interrogation room, hidden deep in the bowels of Chicago's O'Hare Airport, was a masterpiece in the art of applying psychological pressure. The fluorescent lights hummed mercilessly overhead, casting long, sharp shadows on the scratched metal table bolted to the floor. The air was frigid, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Inside this concrete box, the grand romance between the arrogant CFO and his ambitious assistant had completely and finally disintegrated. The illusion of their glittering future had shattered against the brutal reality of federal charges for international drug trafficking. Jessica was a walking mess of smeared mascara and tear-stained silk. Her designer trench coat lay crumpled on a plastic chair. She paced the tight room like a caged animal, her high-pitched, desperate voice trembling as she pointed a finger at Ethan. "He framed me. He told me to pack that suitcase. I had no idea what was in it. He's trying to ruin my life." Ethan sat slumped in a metal chair, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. The confident, calculated corporate director had completely vanished. In his place sat a pathetic, terrified man desperately trying to save his own skin. "She's lying. She's just a mule. I didn't know anything about those drugs. She's trying to pin it all on me." The accusations flew back and forth, a pathetic, disgusting display of self-preservation. A partnership built on stolen money and lies had collapsed into mutual betrayal the second the stakes became real. They had turned on each other, tearing each other apart, completely unaware that they were both already finished. Jamal stood silently by the heavy steel door, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask of state authority. He watched the spectacle with the cool detachment of a seasoned officer accustomed to witnessing the worst of human behavior. He didn't intervene. He just let them dig their graves deeper with each panicked accusation. Then, the heavy metal door unbolted with a loud click. The argument died in a split second. Both Ethan and Jessica snapped their heads toward the sound, their eyes wide with a desperate, pitiful hope that their lawyer had arrived. Instead, I walked in. I wasn't in handcuffs. I wasn't being escorted by tactical officers. I entered the room accompanied by my high-powered corporate attorney, a woman named Evelyn, whose fearsome reputation for destroying corrupt executives preceded her. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm and icy determination. Ethan's jaw dropped. The desperate hope in his eyes vanished completely, replaced by a deep, sickening epiphany. He saw me standing in the doorway, free, untouchable, and protected by a top-tier lawyer. He finally understood that the trap hadn't just snapped shut on Jessica. It had snapped shut on both of them, and I was the one holding the detonator. "Chloe," Ethan whispered, his trembling voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer him. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't throw accusations. I simply walked to the metal table, pulled out the chair opposite him, and sat down. Evelyn stood silently behind me, an intimidating presence radiating ultimate legal authority. I placed a thick, pristine, color-tabbed audit portfolio on the scratched metal surface. The sound of the impact was quiet, yet it resonated in the small room with the powerful finality of a judge's gavel. Ethan stared at the file, his eyes darting frantically between the document and my face. The last remnants of his arrogant facade crumbled to dust, leaving behind only pure, unadulterated terror. He knew what was in that portfolio. He knew exactly what I was holding, and he realized with horrifying certainty that his life as he knew it had just officially come to an end. Ethan stared at the file. The pristine, color-coded tabs seemed to mock the absolute chaos of his current reality. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the thick cardboard cover, but he was too terrified to touch it. He looked up at me, his wide, bloodshot eyes frantically searching for any sign of mercy. He found none. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the cold metal table, and delivered his sentence with chilling, calculated precision. "You really thought I was just imagining it all, didn't you, Ethan?" I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed off the concrete walls. "You spent months trying to convince me I was going crazy. You isolated me. You made me question my own memory. You thought you had broken me down into an obedient, paranoid shell." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of my words press down on his chest. "But you made one fatal mistake," I continued. "You forgot who you married. You forgot that I make my living tearing financial lies to shreds." I reached out and slowly opened the portfolio. The first page revealed a gigantic, incredibly complex flowchart. It traced the exact origin of the $15 million, detailing the fictitious supply chain invoices, the Caymanian shell companies, and the foreign wire transfers. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a meticulously documented roadmap of his corporate treason. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. He stared at the diagram, his eyes tracing the red lines connecting his supposedly perfectly hidden accounts. The blood completely drained from his face. He looked like he was about to physically pass out. "I found the flash drive, Ethan," I said, lowering my voice to a terrifyingly calm state. "The one you tried to bury under 3 pounds of synthetic drugs in my suitcase. The one you thought would guarantee me a life sentence in a Bahamian prison." Jessica let out a choked gasp from the other side of the room, covering her mouth with her hands. She had no idea about the embezzlement. She didn't know the true scale of the monster she had been sleeping with. "I cracked your military-grade encryption in 7 minutes," I stated, leaning back comfortably in my chair. "I copied every single byte of data, the seed phrases to your crypto wallets, the fabricated emails designed to frame me, and, of course, the master ledger of your charming little multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical heist." Ethan made a choked, desperate sound. He gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. "Chloe, please," he whimpered, his voice breaking. "We can fix this. We can make a deal. I'll give you everything. The house, the accounts, whatever you want. Just don't give them that drive." I gave him a small, icy smile. "Are you losing touch with reality, Ethan?" I said, throwing his own favorite line back in his face. I glanced at my watch. It's exactly 10:45 a.m. At precisely 6:00 a.m. this morning, while you were busy loading my suitcase into the SUV, I initiated a secure, automated data transfer. I paused, making sure he caught every single word. I sent the complete, uncensored contents of your flash drive directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, D.C. I forwarded a copy to the SEC's Division of Enforcement, and just to be sure, I sent the entire portfolio to the private email address of your company's CEO. Ethan's eyes rolled back slightly. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the metal table with a dull thud. A low, agonized groan escaped his lips. "You're not just going down for international drug trafficking, Ethan," I concluded, standing up and smoothing the creases on my pants. "You're going down for massive corporate fraud. Your company is already freezing your assets. The FBI is most likely raiding your office right now. You will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." I turned away from the table and walked toward the heavy steel door. I didn't look back at Jessica, who was now sobbing openly, fully realizing her life had just been utterly and irrevocably destroyed. I didn't look back at Ethan, who was whimpering with his face pressed against the cold metal, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man he had once been. Jamal opened the door for me. His expression remained perfectly stoic, but I caught the subtle, respectful nod he gave me as I passed him. I walked out of the interrogation room and into the bright, bustling airport corridor. The air felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating anxiety I had carried for so many months had completely evaporated. The execution was over. The monster was finally in a cage. I walked toward the exit, with my head held high, fully ready to step into a future that, finally, belonged completely and exclusively to me. Looking back at the entire architecture of this profound betrayal, I realized it highlighted one of the most painful, yet ultimately liberating truths a woman could ever uncover. My sense of self-worth was never going to be dictated by a man who deliberately refused to see it, even if that man was the one who had promised to love me until death did us part. For years, I had been the kind of wife who sought validation from a partner who consistently offered only conditional affection, emotional isolation, and brutal psychological manipulation. Whether it was being subtly cut down in the quiet of our own home, abandoned during times of extreme professional exhaustion, or ridiculed for simply trusting my own memory, the heartbreak was always rooted in the desperate, naive hope that our marital vows would eventually guarantee basic human respect. However, the true turning point in my story came the moment I was forced to finally let go of that illusory hope and look strictly at the raw data. The final audit of our marriage was simple. Dismantling his intricate web of lies and walking away from his toxic environment was not an act of cruelty or irrational revenge. It was an absolutely essential act of self-preservation. When I stopped fighting to be valued by a man who was determined to completely erase me, I reclaimed my own inner strength. I realized that while I could not control the monstrous way my husband chose to treat me, I had absolute, undeniable control over what I was willing to accept. By breaking free from his suffocating cycle of emotional abuse and calculated gaslighting, I opened the door to reclaiming my own life and my unclouded mind. I learned that true security is defined by trusting your own instincts in the darkest moments, armed with irrefutable evidence and absolutely no hesitation. True success wasn't about forcing a narcissistic corporate criminal to finally respect me. It was about building a reality so authentically impenetrable that his deceitful opinions no longer mattered in the slightest. I had stopped destroying myself trying to earn the love of a man who constantly put me down, and instead, I had invested all that energy into building a steel cage that he willingly locked himself inside. My name is Chloe, and I'm 33 years old. Today, I was standing in the VIP security line at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, holding a warm vanilla latte in my hand. I was calmly waiting for the trap to snap shut. If you've ever had to outsmart a narcissist who thought you were just a naive little wife, let me know in the comments what city you're watching this from. Leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You simply can't miss this execution.